Right, good morning. Can you hear me now? Very good. You probably can't see me, but I'm Bill Sherman. I have a very bright shirt on, so hopefully you can see the shirt if you can't see me. But it's very nice to welcome everybody, and I'm just going to say a few words of welcome before I hand over to the organizers and chair the first session. Frances Yates, to me, kind of is the Warburg. I mean, I knew Frances Yates as a name and as a scholar before I knew A.B. Warburg, and it's been a huge pleasure to come into the Institute where she still has such a presence. The office and spaces next to mine have lots of her books and archive, and it's been a constant inspiration for me. But I've been very eager for this event to happen. So when Paul and Yuri proposed it, I was very, very keen for this to happen, and I'm glad that it's all finally here. I'm sorry that here is some house rather than the Warburg Institute, and I'll just say very briefly why that's the case. I don't know how many of you have been in the Institute lately, but you'll know that there's a very, very noisy project next door, which is the toddler cognition lab that Birkbeck is building on Torrington Place, and it's causing an enormous amount of noise directly outside the door of our lecture theater, and exposing the fact that our lecture theater door is about as capable. So it's not really good for hearing each other, and this fantastic space was offered to us, and we jumped at the opportunity. The other thing to say is in many ways, there is continuity, and some of you will know, but not everybody, that this was Charles Holden's first building in the Bloomsbury estate of the University of London that he did the master plan for in the 1930s. Built this in 1931 to 7, and then, of course, his last building in the Bloomsbury estate of the University of London, and indeed his last building before he died, was the Warburg Institute building. So Charles Holden is the continuity here. In this space, so it's really fantastic. The last thing I just wanted to say quickly is that there are lots of people from earlier generations who you really would have liked to meet. And I think Frances Yates, for me, tops that list. She's the person from the Warburg's past, and maybe from the past, who I was most sorry not to know in person. Her work gives you a pretty vivid sense of what it might have been like, but many people here did know her, and so I'm especially eager to hear the presentations of those who did know her, hoping that I will get to know her over the next 2 days. So that's what I wanted to say this morning, but the main thing is just thanks to everybody for coming and welcome. And now I will hand over to Paul Taylor, who takes most credit, or deserves most credit, and you can launch us into the first session. Thank you.
Well, my co-organizer Yuri, are you here yet, Yuri? Ah, wonderful. Hello, Yuri. When Yuri and I were organizing this conference, we adopted the principle that if you invite somebody to a conference, then you should let them talk about what they want to talk about, rather than telling them what you would like them to talk about. And as a result, we said to them at the beginning that they could have a very, very wide remit when they were talking about Frances Yates. Either they could give us personal anecdotes of how they knew her, a sort of biographical approach, or they could discuss her work in close detail and say what they thought the successes and also the failings of it were. And then they could also, if they wanted, just give a paper which she might have been interested in a subject which would be something that she would take an interest in. So that was a very, very broad remit, clearly. Now, looking down the list of titles that we've received, I think that it's clear that the speakers have taken us up on that, and we are going to have a great variety of papers today. They're going to be in very different styles, and they're going to adopt very different approaches. There was only really one paper which we sort of semi-commissioned, or at least asked somebody to give, and that was this first paper. Because we thought that it would be good if at the beginning of the conference we could have somebody who could lay out the life of Frances Yates, somebody who knew her, who could give us an idea of how she worked. and that person was Elizabeth McGrath. Elizabeth, of course, has been at the Warburg Institute since the 1960s. She knew Frances Yates well, as she will say during her paper. She is also somebody who probably knows more about the history of the London period of the Warburg Institute than anyone else. And so she will be able to give us a very in-depth account of Frances Yates as she was during her years at the Warburg Institute. Now, Elizabeth McGrath, as most of you know, was the curator of the photographic collection for nearly 40 years, and also the editor of the journal of the Warburg and Cultural Institute. And she is a very distinguished scholar who is a fellow of the British Academy and has won the Mitchell Prize. And she is going to talk to us today about Frances Yates and the Warburg. So, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Paul. Not 40 years curator, Jennifer was half of it, 20 years of it. Well, let me just see, yes. On the occasion of her acceptance of the Premio Galileo Galilei at Pisa in 1978, Frances Yates paid tribute to her colleagues at Warburg for their friendship and sympathetic understanding, and for their solidarity in shared values and what she called disinterested learning. Thus, you see, she went on, though I have lived all these years in England and in the same house, I am a citizen of the world through the Warburg Institute. It was indeed at the Institute that she found a stimulating, encouraging, and sympathetic context to develop and expand her intellectual horizons. She also found there a supportive, even protective environment. It's interesting that she associates her house and the Warburg Institute in a single sentence. Here you see the back garden of her house in Claygate in Surrey, and the Institute not very long after the date of her prize, her Galilei Prize, with Gombrich thrown in for good measure. The Institute became a second home, and her friends there a second family. As far as I'm aware, she never contemplated leaving the Warburg to go anywhere else, and she was always surprised if any of her colleagues chose to do so, or even considered the matter. But then it was natural to her that her family and her scholarly life were bound up together, just as her sisters, who looked after her daily needs, she wasn't very practical, also supported her scholarly life by reading and criticizing drafts of her work. So her close colleagues at the Warburg attended to her emotional as well as her intellectual welfare. Frances Yates' relationship to the Warburg can, I think, be divided into, or be seen in three phases. First is what she herself often called her early Warburgian period, strongly associated with Fritz Saxo and the original members of the Institute. This period of what might be called initiation and integration involved working on the journal and other Warburg publications. As far as her own work was concerned, it also saw the publication of the French Academies and various important articles in the journal on Giordano Bruno and Paolo Sarpi, for example, and the article on Queen Elizabeth as Astrea. Then there's a second phase, presided over by Byng and latterly Gombrich. I'll just show you Frances. This is Frances, as it says, I think, in 1967. The second phase then, presided over by Byng and latterly Gombrich as director, and marked by the start of her long friendship and collaboration with Perkin Walker, a period of growing international reputation. For much of this time, since 1950 to be precise, she was employed at the Institute as a lecturer and then a reader. a post that involved teaching, but also research. This period saw the publication of the studies on Ramon Llull, Campanella, on court and civic festivals, and the volumes on the Valois tapestries of 1959, the articles on Bruno, and of course the celebrated book of 1964 on Bruno, then the still more celebrated Art of Memory of 1966. The final phase from her retirement in 1967 onwards was a time of accumulated honours, FBA in 1967, OBE 1972, DBE 1977, as well as various other academic honours. But it also witnessed the beginning of a reaction against her Hermetic interpretation of the Renaissance, a reaction which, if anything, only seemed to encourage Frances to renew her efforts to uncover hidden histories and occult strands of Renaissance thought, sometimes returning to earlier studies to revise them in this light. It was only in this last period that I knew her, since my arrival at the Institute coincided exactly with her retirement, the time at which she's pictured here. But she was still very much a dominant presence, and I had the good fortune to benefit from her advice, encouragement, and infectious enthusiasm. So first, the early Warburgian period, as she termed it herself. Frances's introduction to the Institute, as many of you will know, was through a meeting with Edgar Vint in 1936. Vint invited her to visit the Warburg, and she has described how, when she did and met Saxo, she felt her eyes and mind open to a whole new world. The Warburg Library and method came to her as a revelation, and a particularly opportune one, as she had been puzzling over Giordano Bruno's strange cosmological dialogue, the Cena delle Ceneri. She had arrived at Bruno through Shakespeare via Florio and Italians living in England, which was where Bruno had composed his dialogue. She always followed subjects and historical characters as they led naturally from one to another, accessing them as much as possible directly through original documents or in their own words. This was a habitual mode of arguing. So-and-so leads to so-and-so, leads to so-and-so, leads to so-and-so. And then you just sometimes begin to fly away in the distance, away from the original thing. It's been pointed out that her eccentric, largely homeschooling, meant that the Yates education consisted of voracious reading of primary sources, though she did devour secondary literature where it was available. So she arrived at the Warburg Institute and met the Warburg scholars with a mind ready and prepared. But she was still dazzled. What was especially new and striking to her, as she often said, was not just that the aim to study the history of culture as a whole, the history, as she put it, of thought, religion, art, but the focus on the role of images and symbolism. And what was also novel and wonderful was the sense of community and the shared enterprise she found. She had been looking for someone to help her understand Bruno's imagery and ideas. She found this and much more. Of course, the Warburg's need for her in 1937 was at least as great as her need for it. Sorry, that won't just go back. The Institute in the late 1930s was at a particularly perilous stage of its existence. Saxo and his colleagues were struggling to establish its value to Britain and promote Warburgian scholarship and ideas through an ambitious program of publication. For this to have an effect, it was essential that the language of communication should be English, and clear, unobfuscating English at that. Anthony Blunt, who had excellent German, had already been enlisted to deal with Walter Friedlander's catalogue of Poussin drawings. That was how he got involved with Poussin. From there, he moved on to the journal. This had been founded in 1937 with Vint and Rudolf Wittkover as editors. And here they are with the first issue of the first volume. Frances was the second English speaker to be taken on as editor. And here you see her many years later, catching up with Blunt over a drink. But her first job for the journal was to translate an article on rhetoric and humanism by Dario Cantimoli, whose important book on Italian heretics was then in the making. The latter work was to be of crucial importance for Frances. I often heard her mention it with reverence decades later. Encouraged by the editors, she herself contributed to that same issue of Volume 1, an entertaining article of her own on Italian teachers in Elizabethan England. It begins, "The learning of languages was more essential to the Elizabethan than to the modern English, for the simple reason that in those days, English was a language spoken only in England." And it ends with a plea that to remember the ties that bind Britain to Europe. Of course, this is during the war. Since this slide shows Frances's own copy of the journal, which I inherited, I hold her responsible for the teacups. It was after Vint's departure for the United States and disengagement from the journal that Frances became an editor herself with Volume 6 in 1943. She was formally appointed that year with the official title of Director of Publications. In this role, she was more quickly and fully integrated into the place than might have otherwise happened. On the one hand, editing proved a training ground for her in Warburgian theories and methods. Remember, many of the articles were published by Warburg scholars, and she had to rewrite their Germanic English. And on the other hand, she was instrumental in shaping the style in which Warburgian cultural history and interdisciplinary scholarship was presented to the world in English. Anthony Grafton has commented on this in connection with her important role in the genesis and content of Arnaldo Momigliano's celebrated article on ancient history and the antiquarian in volume 13 of 1950. Here he is looking very uncharacteristically benign. He was usually quite formidable. Momigliano had especially asked for Frances to help with his article because of her, I quote, exceptional experience of Anglo-Italian cultural relations. But as editor, she regularly found herself thrown in at the deep end with topics she might never have engaged with otherwise. This must have encouraged that intellectual fearlessness she always displayed, epitomized in the advice she habitually gave to friends, colleagues, and pupils, that to get to grips with an unfamiliar subject, one should just plunge in and splash around. If she contributed much to the publications of other scholars, she herself benefited immensely from the input of fellow Warburgians. In the preface to her great book on the French academies, published after the war but completed some years earlier, she talked of how her colleagues had provided, I quote, not only the enrichment of their knowledge on countless points, but the stimulus of their comradeship, adding, if there is anything of value in it, it is the result of a cooperative effort. The formulation is excessively modest, but collective effort indeed went into the book. Bing, Wittkover, and Charles Mitchell provided close reading and of deep drafts and proofs, and Anne-Marie Meyer, then a young secretary, was another assiduous helper. Zaxel, of course, was actively involved too, as he was in everything. Looking back in 1975, in the introduction to her Estrella book, Frances still wanted to emphasize that the manuscript, she quotes, of the original article, that is, was read by Fritz Zaxel shortly before his death. She herself regularly talked of how her early Warburgian period, in this period, the seeds of many later themes were planted. Reflecting in her diary of 1948 on a conversation she had with Zaxel about Dürer and Erasmus, following a lecture Zaxel had given on this subject, his last lecture given at the Warburg. She comments affectionately, if somewhat quaintly, "Little mannequin who has not long to live." Well, she was a big lady, and he wasn't very tall. Adding, "I am glad to have lived in that world again." This is writing in 1947. 48, sorry. I'm not sure if she means the world of Dürer, as evoked by Zaxel, or the world of the Institute under Zaxel's guidance after it reopened in London after the war. And I think she probably means both. Well, from the start, Frances was clear that she must have time and space for her own work, her own research, the work that gave meaning to her life. She had been brought up with the luxury, which she fully realized was a rare luxury, of leisure for reading, writing, and thinking. The terms of her job as editor allowed for this, as did her appointment as lecturer in 1950, and then reader. Still, she gave the Institute back plenty in terms of value for money. The 1950s saw Frances begin to influence the direction of research there, and the scholarly world's perception of the place. An immense contribution on her part was the introduction of Perkin Walker, whose significance for the Warburg and for scholarship has perhaps not been sufficiently recognized. She and Perkin then went off to convince Bashi Sabra to take up study of medieval Arabic science, a topic which has since borne such fruit at the Institute. With Perkin, who brought to bear his musicological expertise, she made new contacts with French and Netherlandish as well as Italian scholars. For example, in the colloque on festivals organized by Jean Jacot and the CNRS in Paris and Tours. And here is a nice photo of Frances and Perkin at Tours with their friend Giuseppe Milanovic. Perkin ready with his wrapped bottle for the next stage in the proceedings. Frances Yates, as we'll hear more of, can be said to have inaugurated the history of European festivals and pageantry as a serious scholarly subject. And she saw the significance of these fleeting creations, from court performances to civic decorations, as evidence of the hopes and aspirations of people in the past. Themes which to her were just as worthy of historical investigation as the facts and realities that often dashed these hopes to pieces. Lost causes, as we'll hear, I think, were to become a leitmotif of her work. I don't, alas, have a photo of them, of the trip that Frances, Perkin and Byng embarked on in 1956 through Italy, Byng driving. Michael Blackstone has remarked, all her friends were uneasy about Byng and the motor car, but I doubt if Frances ever worried at all when she entrusted herself to Byng's care, since how people drove was among the many things in life that Frances did not notice. On the topic of not noticing, I recall that when she asked her student, Alison Kuder, why she had missed a certain seminar the previous week, she was astonished to hear that Alison had been busy giving birth. Frances never having noticed the young woman's advancing pregnancy. Still, she was observant enough of the character of people. It seems that it was after the death of Saxo in particular that Frances and Byng became very close. Joe Trapp has eloquently characterized the strength of their friendship, which never faltered. She herself testified to it in the preface to The Art of Memory, writing. I'll just go on to this one. Here's Byng looking in her most characteristic, apparently, with a cigarette and a glass of whiskey in her garden. She writes, Frances writes, now that the memory book is at last ended, the memory of the late Gertrude Byng seems that more poignantly present than ever. In the early days, she read and discussed my drafts, watching constantly over my progress or lack of progress, encouraging and discouraging me by turns, ever stimulating with her intense interest and vigilant criticism. She felt that the problems of the mental image, of the activation of images, of the grasp of reality through images, problems ever present in the history of the art of memory, were close to the themes which preoccupied A.B. Warburg, whom I knew only through her. I dedicate it to her memory with deep gratitude for her friendship. So to the final period of Frances' life at the Warburg. The Art of Memory was published in 1966, the year before her retirement, by Routledge Press. And here she is again. This is at the beginning and the end of this period that I'm talking about. A late photo is taken at Perkin Walker's in his garden. So in fact, the Bruno book had been published by the same press, Routledge, 2 years earlier. In fact, nothing Frances published after 1960 appeared under the aegis of the Warburg Institute, either in the journal or any other way. I make this point as I imagine that some of the wilder trains of connection in her later work might have been reined in had they been submitted to the scrutiny of Gombrich and other colleagues, and the editorial pencil of Joe Trapp. Of course, had this happened, she might not have been so famous, and here's a testimony to her fame, the plaque on her birthplace. The plaque, yes. And the Institute might then not have such a great benefit from her estate with the fellowships endowed through this. Frances herself was not unaware that her colleagues were skeptical about aspects of her work. A review of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, published in 1973 in the journal History of Science by Perkin Walker, who was at her side through the writing of it, is a fascinating dissection of the argument with the aim of isolating the weaker parts and inviting the reader to treat them as merely suggestive, so as to emphasize the value of Yates's evocation of a general religious philosophical atmosphere in the period in question. He understood the almost missionary spirit in which Yates explored the irenic, mystical, and syncretic movements of the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, and why she stretched out in her late work, and sometimes stretched the evidence to breaking point and beyond, in order to suggest indications to coming generations of what lines of research might be fruitfully pursued. It has to be said, too, that in her longing to pay tribute to those who strove for world peace and harmony, Frances was more in touch with the ideas and ideals of the historical period she made her own than with the politics of the world she was living in. As I said, it was in this last phase that I came to know her. I arrived at the Warburg to begin a PhD just at the point when she retired, so I was never her student in any way. But she did take a real interest in my thesis topic, which was on a civic festivity, the decoration of the city of Antwerp for the reception of the new governor of the Spanish Netherlands in 1635. Of course, I immediately had to overcome an obstacle of prejudice, such as Frances Miss Yates, as she was to me, was never reluctant to apply to historical figures and movements. As Warburg has remarked, she made no secret of who were her favourites and who were her villains. She didn't much like the Habsburgs, and the new governor, Cardinal Infante Ferdinand, was one of them, brother of Philip IV. She wasn't too sure about Rubens either, as a representative of the Spanish Netherlands, which was for her a historical disaster after the hopes of freedom and unity embodied in William the Silent. But I persuaded her that the most important theme of the entry, a plea to the new governor by the city of Antwerp for peace and an end to the 80 Years' War, embodied in the imagery devised by Rubens, was something worthy of her consideration. This is a detail of one of the pageants, the Temple of Janus, with peace trying to close the door as the fury of war escapes. After all, it was another case of a lost hope of what might have been in history. Through Frances, I was able to participate in the conference and festivals at Tours in 1972, where I met for the first time, among others, her former students Margaret McGowan and Sidney Anglo. Later, as a member of the photo collection, I helped with photos and visual evidence for her books, especially the 1975 Astrea. She thanks me in the preface to that for my enthusiasm, something which gives me particular pleasure, since her enthusiasm for any discoveries I made or we made together among books and photos is an abiding and happy memory of being in her company. Many have commented on this quality, to enthuse and be enthused, and her ability to empathize with and engage together with others in an excited, almost childlike way, in the fun of a joint search to interpret an obscure image or to uncover neglected episodes in history. I end with this photo of 1977, partly because Paul said I had to, but also because it shows her as well as me. If you don't recognize me, I'm wearing the same beads. But also because it shows her the way I remember her. You see her here, at once careless of her appearance, and at the same time dutifully dressed up for the occasion, which was a party to celebrate her being elevated to damehood. With her usual gold brooch, the best one, and her fancy silver lined jacket, and the awkwardly clasped handbag. Best of all, the photo shows something of her characteristic gaze, abstracted, but at the same time focused and penetrating. Thank you.
We can do questions at the end of the session, so I'll introduce our next speaker, Margaret McGowan. Let me just see if I can...
I forgot how to get it.
Let's give Margaret's place. Margaret McGowan studied with Frances Yates. She was a PhD student at Frances Yates, and I understand yesterday that she had a bit of a problem with Frances to begin with. Her PhD subject was on dance in the French courts of the 16th century, and she was sort of rather surprised when Frances started seeing esoteric symbolism in these dance texts. And for a long time they had arguments about this, and eventually Margaret managed to get her to stop seeing esoteric symbolism. And then Frances then moved on to edit the text, and of that, of course, she was superb because she was a particularly experienced editor and writer. She has remained in touch with the Warburg Institute all her life. She was, of course, the chair of the advisory board of the Warburg Institute during a very difficult phase recently when our court case was being resolved with the university. She's had also a distinguished career as an expert on French culture of the 16th and 17th centuries and was professor at Sussex. She's one of the founding sort of figures in dance studies generally. Now, her topic today, I have no idea what it's going to be about. I've been curious about this all the way through. All I do know is that it's going to be in some way about harmony, which I think is a particularly interesting subject. And I was also told by Margaret that she was very happy to speak second. She thought that was just about the right place in the order, so I don't know why that should be, but I look forward to her paper. And after she has finished, then Elizabeth and Margaret can come up here and we can have some questions before tea and coffee. So Margaret.
Thank you, Paul. I want to start with Frances Yates' notion that ideas and hopes which history has left behind shouldn't be neglected, since in their time they impacted on men's minds, played a role in politics and propaganda, and found expression in art and writing.
Margaret, just for a second, I'm going to make the microphone a bit closer.
Am I not better?
I think that will be better, yeah.
Thank you. Is that better?
Yeah.
Elizabeth has already mentioned her book Astrea and her contributions to Jean-Jacques Fête de la Renaissance, where she argued that the revival of imperialism was a phantom revival. And she insisted that it was precisely because it was illusory that it was an idea of incalculable importance, since it was used and abused by princes, their writers, and their artists. Today, I want to explore the power of another illusion, one of the many invented symbolic ideas destined to appear on triumphal arches in princely entries across Europe, an idea closely linked to the force and effect of imperialism. I refer to Concordia, a concept which embodied desires for harmony and peace, which so rarely materialized in war-torn Europe of the 16th century. The dangers inherent in the absence of harmony between nations was summed up in this image that you see on the screen, an anonymous engraving published in 1622 and entitled, curiously, Ballet Guerrier des Nations. You see on the left, Discordia stoking the fire. Crowned queens, each bearing a sword, are drawn in formation across the space. They represent Gallia, Hispania, Germania, Anglia, Polonia, Italia, and Muscovia. And you will see behind the armed combats, behind in the distance. The inscription, stretched across the image, details the dire consequences of division and disunion. Discordia Christianorum principum quam magna harmonium caedes, urbum eversiones et populorum rebelliones consequentur. Although the image exemplifies the matter that concerns me today, it belongs to the end of the period I'm considering. So allow me to go back and take that image off if I can. I'm not quite sure what I do to take it off. Can you read?
I can see what I can do.
Thank you very much.
You can just close the laptop.
It would be distracting if you had that on the time, I think. So, let me go back in time to the historian and politician Cyrus. In his narrative on the Jugurthan War, he reported the advice of the king of Numidia on his deathbed to his nephew Jugurtha. And he said, "I leave your kingdom, which will be strong if you act honourably, but weak if you are ill-affected to each other. For by concord, even small states are increased, but by discord, even the greatest fall to nothing." The powerful and beneficent effects of concord were always present in Cyrus' mind. For they are articulated again in Menenius' speech to the Senate regarding the choices to be made between liberty and infamy, and his counsel to Julius Caesar when he wrote, "The advantages of concord are therefore to be secured, and the evils of discord to be banished." The memorable formulation of the Numidian king's dying instruction was remembered by compilers of mythologies and by creators of triumphal arches. They incorporated Cyrus' words in their explanations of the meanings hidden beneath the symbolism. In Giovanni Giavoni's extended elaboration on l'apparatio fata dell'Ispizio di Fossi for the entry of Ferdinando de' Medici into Pisa in 1688, Concordia is depicted as a grand lady holding a cornucopia. Without mentioning Cyrus, Savone actually repeats his words. Per la concordia le cose piccole diventano grandi, e le grandissime per la discordia vanno in ragione. After the years of strife between the cities of Florence and Pisa, the rewards of concord are celebrated. Peace, fertility, and prosperity are shown thriving on the temporary structure behind the figure of Concordia. The Pisa example is but one of many. The study of selected depictions of Concordia from entries in Spain, France, and the Low Countries will show how particular political and religious contexts determine the frequency with which this figure occurs and the fragility of the hopes embodied in it. The planners of entries into the Iberian Peninsula were anxious at one and the same time to advertise their erudition, to encourage citizens and princes to embrace speech, peace, so that art and letters might prosper, and for Spanish monarchs in particular, to take their imperial status to bring an end to strife. Concord was to be established through imperial ambitions which lingered on as an intellectual, cultural, and political project, despite the fragile prospect of success. Thus, in Toledo in 1560, the reception of Elizabeth of France, newly betrothed to Philip II, the very first car designed by Romano was dedicated to Concord. She appeared crowned with olive leaves, accompanied by two crows and holding the arms of France and Spain, powers that had been at war and which were shortly to enter further conflict as the wars of religion burst out in France in 1562. The decoration for the final car returned to the theme of perpetual concord, with an inscription which made the benefits abundantly clear. It claimed that if the two powerful kingdoms of Spain and France continued to enjoy their present concord, then the Turkish threat would be eliminated, the Moors would become peaceful citizens, and the impious religion of Luther would be destroyed. 10 years later, Philip II, on his entry into Seville in 1570, found another Concordia, depicted on the first arch with a crow and the inscription Concordia Servit. Juan de Marilaura, the author of the account of the entry, explains her presence and her faithful companion, basing his argument on texts from Ilian, Poliziano, Guillaume du Choule, and on a surviving medal of Faustina. Concordia and her crow illustrate the feelings of all the citizens towards their king. As subjects, they had been brought up to know and respect Concordia, and in order to confirm that fact, a figure from each of the 34 territories subject to Seville paraded before Philip II. Each one came in peace to pay homage and present gifts. There were no such demonstrations of fidelity in France during the years of religious strife, when at every turn the Protestant armies, Henri de Navarre and the Prince de Condé, confronted royal troops, often strengthened by foreign mercenaries. It wasn't surprising that the presence of Concordia and Discordia dominated the symbolism of royal entries, where at Lyon, for instance, the theme of peace, concord, and faith recurred throughout. The narration of the event begins with the improbable statement, Dieu, par un roi adolescent, a voulu restaurer les ruines d'un royaume si riche et spacieux que celui de France. Car à cela peut satisfaire l'opinion politique qui fait des rois compagnons des dieux. Believe in God and in the efficacy of the young Charles IX's device, Justitia and Pietas, revealed how desperate the devices of the century were. Depicted on the theatre erected at the Port Saint-Éloi, on a large painting was seen a young crowned prince playing harmoniously on his lute. Sprawled below was Discordia, a grimacing old man studiously braiding the strings of his lute. Of course, civil disorder was overcome by the king's melodies, made evident by the swarm of bees and other symbols of concord who came to settle beside the monarch. Musical harmony represented by Charles IX playing the lute reflected the hopes for that condition in political affairs. As this text makes clear on the Temple of Honor, where Sallust's adage is used, Concordia res parva crescunt, Discordia maxima dilabunt. In this final tribute, however, there's a clear shift to the role of Catherine de Medici. At the Pont Saint-Jean, an inscription transferred the real source of the end of war and the establishment of concord to the Queen Mother. It is to your wisdom that our age owes the fact that peace and concord flourish and war has been tamed. The inscription spoke more of hope than reality. Although in 1571, when Charles IX and his new Queen Elizabeth entered Paris, some sort of peace, La Paix de Saint-Germain, had been temporarily manufactured after bitter years of war and bloodshed. And it was to Catherine de Medici that Jean d'Aurac et Pierre de Ronsard gave the credit. The Fontaine du Porceau, a goddess with the features remarkably like those of the Queen Mother, stood on a pedestal. Two thermales on each side as she held aloft a map of Gallia. These two structures were decorated with symbols signifying vigilance and promptitude, and the end of civil strife. A conspicuous element was a lute, which received the most detailed interpretation, represented peace, and that concorde tant recherché par la distraite. The symbolism is further developed to capture more precisely the nature of the Queen's achievement. The lute is made to play different tunes and sounds. A hard-working hand plucks at the strings to produce sweet harmonies to resolve harsh noise, just as the same knowing figures have brought into harmony discord and passion. Ainsi, qui peut a bien su faire cette règle, laquelle est si bien et heureusement accordée les parties discordantes, qu'il en est sorti une très désirée paix, union et concorde, et a été le moyen de la guerre signifiée par le pointe de l'Épiroque. And these figures written in gold upon a blue background can be used for the portrait. De maintenir un état florissant en son entier n'est chose trop commune, mais le sauver quand il est périssant, il n'est donné en ce monde qu'à une. Despite this praise and confidence, war returned to France in greater force after the massacre of St. Bartholomew in 1572. Although the Queen Mother continued to wear the clothes of Concordia, as the Duc d'Anjou discovered when he entered the city of Tours in 1576. The first image which confronted him there was a large altar upon which his mother, standing between portraits of himself and his brother, King Henri IV. The Queen was Concord, in the act of pouring wine into a vase held with hands joined together. Beside her sat a pelican and a stork, signifying charity, delectation, and maternal friendship. Behind, beneath the arcade, her influence was printed on the vault, where broken weapons had become the home of busy bees forming their hive. The author of the narrative, Dr. Nansen, explained that here union and concord prevailed, securing dominion over all. Again, the explanation hardly matched the facts, as civil religious strife extended further and further across the land. Moving my analysis to the Low Countries, it becomes apparent that it is civic festivals there in major cities that were even more reason to extol the benefits of Concordia. Although Omegan and princely entries provided temporary ceremonies of festive unity and a community coming together in the interests of economic prosperity, festival books themselves uncovered the stark realities of Spanish rule. In 1582, when the Duc d'Anjou had been invited to take over power in Flanders from Philip of Spain, his entry into the cities of Antwerp, Bruges, and Ghent was a political ceremony. I'll confine my remarks to Antwerp, 1582. The preface to the official account dedicated to the Duke rehearsed all the reasons for resorting to arms against Spanish rule. The first theatre exposed l'insatiable convoitise, haine et immodérée tyrannie de domination espagnole, and announced the presence of the Duke would put an end to désolation, calamité, misère, et que ce pays était réduit par l'unique domination patrie et par la plus inique et injuste guerre, laquelle les ennemis constituent pour achever de ruiner le pays avec tout genre de calamité et oppression. In this context, Concordia had a significant role to play, and it could be found everywhere. Facing the maid of Antwerp on her car at the start of the proceeding, guarding imprisoned the Discordia, secured in chains, lurking behind Jonathan and David and behind Lady Antwerp, and prominently present beside the ducal throne. Most dramatic was her presence astride a naval and marine monster, diversely interpreted as tyranny, or symbolizing Antwerp's prosperity from the sea. The ambiguity is interesting, since both interpretations were equally appropriate to the current condition of the city. Throughout, this continuum of Concordia is sustained by a change mode of presentation. The paint and simulated marble of Italian and French symbolism are here replaced by young maidens bearing the recognizable attributes of Concordia, who, as a final and fitting climax to the performance, is absorbed into Apollo and music, whose harmony banishes discord, violence, and tyranny forever. These repeated pleas are all in vain. By 1584, all three cities, Antwerp, Bruges and Ghent, were back under Spanish rule. However, although Concordia had proved illusory once again, efforts and hopes to bring about her common influence did not cease, and they came from unexpected quarters. When Philip III of Spain made his spectacular entry into Lisbon in 1619, among the many extravagant displays erected to welcome him, the most extraordinary was that created by the Flemish residents. At its centre was Discordia. The merchants acknowledged that disorder was rife among the 17 provinces of the Netherlands, and they set out on their arch how heresy had incited citizens to rebellion, and its many aspects were depicted there. What was needed, the inscriptions spelled out on their arch, was a prudent monarch supported by amity and concord from his subjects. The merchants demonstrated that their own animus concordos, through the human harmonies they created, and assumed the responsibility of guiding their rebellious compatriots to peace and concord. On their arch, German merchants argued that Spain and German states actually enjoyed perpetual concord. The ultimate message of this entry was that divisions always destroy the kingdom, and only that which is sustained by Concordia endures. Indeed, concord supports and flourishes in a realm ruled by one governor, and Lavanade, the author of the account of the ceremony, brings the reader back to the illusory imperial aspiration of one world, one monarch, a theme which had already dominated the reception of Philip II into the city in 1581. Lavanade ends with this flourish: as God in the heavens rules alone, as the sun with its light controls innumerable stars, so one crowned head can rule the world, because love suffers no companion. The same joint presence of Concordia and Discordia was to be emphasized again in Rubens' creation for the Temple of Janus from 1635, which Elizabeth showed you earlier, for the entry of Cardinal Infante into Antwerp. She showed the temple doors open, displaying at one same time war and its miseries, with discord, strife, poverty and grief, in short, calamita publica on one side, and on the other side, repose and concord, bringing abundance and fertility, felicitas temporum. This was the choice to be made. The hesitation is significant, as that trust in the capacity of Concordia to bring peace and prosperity seems to be weighed against equally the inevitability of war. What will happen is then open to doubt. Why this persistence in promoting Concordia, when patiently it was unachievable? We have to remember that the prevailing principle at this time, with regard to how the world was constructed, was a system of opposites. Most writers believed that there was nothing in the universe which did not have its opposite. Without a discourse can no concord. This wrote typically John Norton in his Labyrinth of Man's Life of 1614. Concord's presence on monuments of celebration was always counterbalanced by an equally stirring depiction of discordia, indicating a recognition of the continuing threat of disorder. As the size and depth of suffering brought on by civil unrest and war increased, so the expression of hopes for relief became more extravagant. The violent context, hostility hostilities against Turks, conflict between Protestant and Catholic, rebellion against tyranny. This context was itself responsible for the urge to paint a dream world, so removed from that which was experienced daily. Outpourings of desire for civic harmony were found everywhere, in political tracts, and advice to princes, as well as on triumphal arches. And as Francis noted, in writing from the dedications of his paraphrases of the four Gospels, the principal monarchs of the Western world, had urged upon them, God send grace, that the spirits of the Gospels may likewise join the hearts of you all four together in mutual amity and concord, as your names in the Gospel book aptly control. There was in addition the authority of Plato to support such advice, and the Republic had stressed throughout the essential role of concord in his vision of an ideal state. In Book 4 we read, in our city, the language of harmony and concord will often be heard more than in any other. Such advocacy, commented upon and interpreted ad nauseam by followers of Plato, served to reinforce the determination of organizers of entry. In their eyes, in privileging Concordia as they did, they sought to influence citizens as well as princes, to bring communities together, to provide conditions where arts and letters would flourish, where progress might be made towards economic prosperity. For the creators of spectacle, and for those who gazed on their work, concord was a comforting illusion. Such nostalgia also prompted them to revisit the deeds of their national heroes, whom they represented as models, who had understood how recognizing the importance of Concordia in a state had achieved harmony through victorious acts. Thus, François Ier is resurrected at Lyon in 1564, a host of ancestors performed at Seville in 1570, Roman emperors and Emperor Charles V himself, whose victories over barbarians and the heresies of Luther were extolled in Lisbon in 1581. The perfections of great Burgundian dukes were celebrated in Antwerp in 1582, and a galaxy of imperial victors were present in the same city in 1635. Despite these obvious proofs of the need for a strong military presence to record past glory and to counter present acts of mutiny, exhibiting hopes and feeling through the benign effects of Concordia made citizens' needs and even their demands explicit. What is remarkable was the extraordinary relish with which writers promoted Concordia and explained the meaning of the symbolism attached to its many different attributes. Such eagerness and thoroughness suggests that they weren't only concerned to show off their skills at recovering images from the past, but also stated the display of erudition evident in their interpretations. All authors of official accounts of these occasions expanded on the meanings hidden beneath their chosen images and sought support that they had selected from the works of so-called authorities. Thus Lopez de Ruiz from Madrid was 1570, and Juan de Mailava was Seville in the same year. They cited Asiati, Valeriano, Poliziano, Colonna, and Duchou, as well as many ancient authors, and pointed to the verification which could be found on Roman coins. Inscriptions, often supplied by local humanists and poets, have burdened the triumphal structure, cast in Latin and displayed in authentic classical script, and sometimes translated into the vernacular. They gave further testimony to impressively hidden truths. For these writers, the celebration of concealment was not mere obfuscation, but evidence of their belief in the value and power of persuasion located in a figure like Concordia. This conviction is present in all the entries I examined, but it received received its most overt expression in Alfonso Cavivoli's account of Cardinal Morosini's welcome into Brescia in 1591. He opened his book with an analysis of the benefits of using symbols in public celebration. He outlines their power of persuasion, acknowledges that although they might at first convey little to the populace at large, citizens will, he claimed, be intrigued by the mystery or want explanations, and these will enlighten, infuse, and console. On the first arch for Morosini's entry, the Arch of Litigations, Concordia is given private place, for it represented the benefits which came from the Cardinal's prudence and vigilance in all the negotiations he had conducted to ease the Turkish threat of Constantinople and to support the Republic of Venice's trading operations with the East. And in the council he had provided to facilitate the end of civil disorder both in France and in Brescia. These happy consequences are stated unequivocally. Ironically, their complex connection with the diverse ways Cavivol presents Concordia becomes less clear as his enthusiasm for multiplying explanations actually obscures meaning. Although it has been claimed that obscurity of symbols makes the message finally discovered all the more memorable, amplification of the kind so often offered in accounts of victories does lead to ambiguity and hardship. Indeed, with the luxury of multiple interpretations, Concordia was indispensable. It stood for aspirations so rarely realized, yet their expression in this symbolic form helps to understand the feelings and mental anguish of citizens so helpless in this tempestuous period. Must also be recognized that displays of Concordia were often engineered for the benefit of international relations, as a diplomatic tool, made to impress, influence, and please ambassadors, persuading them of the prince's good intentions. Throughout her work, Frances Yates emphasized how enlightening it was to include analyses of these hopes from the past, which never materialized, demonstrating her views through her study of the phantom revival of theories. I've attempted to trace another illustrative idea, that of Concordia, and to show its resilience. Both these phantom notions survived, but neither desires for harmony and concord, nor the dream of universal monarchy could be scattered. The phantom of empire was appropriated by Protestants for Frederick V's electoral palatine to further their cause, and both were resurrected for King Louis XIII. They accompanied his royal reception in Reims in October 1610. They decorated the Palace of Felicity and the Place Royale with the Carrousel 1612. And the king is created universal monarch at his entry into the capital of 1628, having brought, it was then thought, concord of the entire kingdom with his decisive victory at La Rochelle. But these, however, are matters for another day.
So now we have Margaret Turing from the University of Warwick, who's a reader there in, it's so hard to keep close and read something, in theatre and performance studies. And she is the co-founder of the European Festival Studies series, which of course Margaret is also involved in, and the brilliant digitization program of festival books, principally in the British Museum, the British Library, sorry, I'm still back in the 70s. And she's also worked on relationship with Shakespeare, not the relationship particularly with festivals, but Shakespeare in performance in various contexts. So, Margaret.
Could we turn the image off?
Oh, yes.
Please. I think I can look into the projector.
If we shut it, it's still going to happen.
That's all right, I think we'll
No.
start.
Turn the projector off. No, it's not right to have it. Have you got enough light?
Yes, there's plenty of light. That's all right, I'm not looking into it. Thank you. I've called my paper Strands in a Legacy. Sorry, no one near the microphone. Is that better?
Yes.
Sorry. Sorry. There we go. I've called my paper Strands in a Legacy, Yates's research and cross-disciplinary instincts as part of a pattern leading to the founding of the Society for European Festivals Research. I knew she didn't know that's what she was doing, but that's what we have done since. Strands in a Legacy is my way of expressing a weaving together of influences associated with people, places, ideas, and approaches, sometimes in a subconscious process, linked to wider shifts in scholarship and attitudes, often across generations of researchers, constantly evolving without losing sight of the past. This morning, we've heard about some of the strands woven into the fabric of Frances Yates's contribution to pan-European cross-disciplinary research and writing, including the Warburg itself as a home to Yates's research and teaching, and her personal intuitive energy to find connections and to shape them into an overarching narrative of the culture of the Renaissance. We have heard, too, of Yates's fascination with and contribution to French festival studies. I hope to combine these, along with subsequent phases of research, further people and places, to trace the evolution of attitudes that have led to the foundation of the Society for European Festivals Research and its current publication series, European Festival Studies, 1450 to 1700. I should say at once that I never had the pleasure of meeting Frances Yates. Indeed, until I was invited to participate in this conference on her work and legacy as a representative of the Warwick School of Research into Renaissance and Early Modern Culture and Festivals, I had not had reason to articulate the importance of Yates's legacy that was there from the very start of my own university career, as I was about to plunge in and splash around. Inevitably, what I say will be rooted in my own experience and will feature the contribution of colleagues at Warwick. But, as I hope to make clear, no scholarship can exist in isolation as it moves to define and provide resources for the study of topics that cross boundaries of disciplines, as well as the physical boundaries of places and ideas. As one of the universities founded in the UK in the late 1960s, Warwick's departments and faculties were shaped to a considerable extent by the founding professors and heads of departments, appointed under the then Vice-Chancellor, Jack, later Lord Butterworth. In the arts, these included J.R. Hale in history, G.K. Hunter in English and comparative literature, Judy Rawson in history, Judy Rawson in Italian, I skipped a line, Julian Gardner in history of art, and Donald Charlton in French. In history in particular, a team was soon to develop with a strong emphasis on the Renaissance. Michael Mallet, Henry Cohn, Henry Kamen, Jack Scarisbrick, Bernard Kapp, Humphrey Butters, and Martin Lowry. And it was not long before a postgraduate program in Renaissance studies with some cross-departmental collaboration developed. In the mid-1970s, theatre studies was established at Warwick with its own founding professor, Michael Booth. In the late 1970s, just as universities were forced to respond to the University Grants Council's directive not to hire new staff, J.R. Ronnie Mulrine was appointed in English in 1977, and I joined the staff of theatre studies in 1978. Peter Mack followed soon, having of course completed doctoral research at the Warburg Institute. Ronnie's route from Belfast to Warwick included St Catherine's College, Cambridge, and an appointment as a Fellow of the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham, under Allardyce Nicholl, before joining the staff of the English department at the University of Edinburgh. He was persuaded to leave Edinburgh by G.K. Hunter and by the presence of Renaissance studies in the Faculty of Arts at Warwick. My appointment to Warwick followed doctoral research at the Shakespeare Institute, by then directed by T.J.B. Spencer. My research was on 17th century plays and performance in their own time. But my background was in English language and literature, with research training in theatre history, bibliography and paleography, and editorial methodologies from the Shakespeare Institute. Theatre studies itself was a comparatively new discipline in its own right. It was inherently multidisciplinary and was concerned not just with plays, but with performing spaces, architecture and scenography, light and sound, performers and their audiences in a wide range of social, cultural, and economic contexts, both historical and contemporary. It all looked quite exciting, but within 2 years, the Renaissance Studies programme at Warwick was threatened with closure. At that point, Ronnie and I found ourselves, along with colleagues from departments across the faculty, devising 2 formal MA programmes to be taught by the newly created Graduate School of Renaissance Studies, along with regular research seminars, conferences and doctoral research opportunities, and with its own dedicated, if rather limited, space. 2 of our earliest conferences concerned performance, English and Italian Renaissance theatre, and theatre and government under the early Stuarts, while a third focused on war, literature and the arts in 16th century Europe, and another on Italian Renaissance festivals and their European influence. These were partly a natural progression of the research interests within the graduate school, and partly a response to several publications that had attracted our attention. Sidney Anglow's Spectacle, Pageantry and Early Tudor Policy, first published in 1969. Roy Strong's Art and Power, Renaissance Festivals, 1450 to 1650, first published in 1973, and The Cult of Elizabeth, Elizabethan Portraiture and Pageantry, also by Strong, 1977, as well as Orwell and Strong's 2-volume edited collection on Inigo Jones and the Theatre of the Stuart Court, 1973, and Stephen Orwell's The Illusion of Power, Political Theatre in the English Renaissance, 1975. And, of course, Yates's Astrea, The Imperial Theme in the 16th Century, 1975, later reprinted, of course, in 1993. I would like to concentrate on Astrea for a few minutes, as it seems to me to encapsulate key strands of Yates's legacy in the context of festivals research. Please forgive me if this is familiar to many of you. I hope that my reasons for this outline will become clear. The book is divided into 3 parts: Charles V and the Idea of Empire, 1 essay; the Tudor Imperial Reform, 3 essays; and the French Monarchy, 4 essays, with a conclusion on Astrea and the Gallic Hercules, and 3 appendices: allegorical portraits of Queen Elizabeth I at Hatfield House, Boissard's costume book and 2 portraits, and Antoine Caron's paintings for triumphal arches. Frances Yates had joined the Warburg, we've heard this history, in 1941, becoming editor of the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes. And she was later to become reader in the history of the Renaissance before her retirement in 1967, when she became an honorary fellow and was elected a fellow of the British Academy. In her preface and acknowledgements to Astrea, dated, remember, 1973, Yates introduced the volume as a collection of essays with the explanation that some of them were old and needed rewriting for the collection in the light of later experience and knowledge, while some essays, also old, again in her words, demanded to be left unaltered as moments of past experience which still seemed valid for the present. She wrote, "Some essays belong to an early Warburgian period. This applies particularly to the piece after which the volume is named, Queen Elizabeth I as Astrea. Others reflect a French period. The rewriting and the two short pieces newly written for this book belong to the present, that is 1973. But she also went on to explain, and again in her words, the actual work and research represented in the book was done, much of it, more than 20 years ago, in the 50s. None of it is later than the 1950s. Even the newly written essays use unpublished lectures of that time. And she says, in going through my notes, I have been reminded of even earlier times. Queen Elizabeth as Astrea, first published in the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes in 1947, was first published at that point. Yates explains that it belongs to a time when inspiring scholars and an inspiring library were newly arrived from Germany. She adds, in fact, that essay, as published in 1947, seems to contain, towards the end, premonitions of all the other essays, and even of many of my other books. On the final page of the preface, Yates writes quite simply, to the founder of the Warburg Institute, who arranged his library to inspire and facilitate historical subjects, which should include such subjects as the idea of the empire or festivals and their symbolism. This book owes its existence. Astrea's scope ranged from the church and Renaissance humanism to the New World, poetry to political treaties, and the importance of the Latin language are all significant. Some of the essays in the volume had been printed in French translations in the collections edited by Jean Jacot, following various conferences organized by him in Paris and Tours. These included the entry of Charles IX and his queen into Paris in 1571, published in Les Fêtes de la Renaissance in 1956, and Charles V and the idea of the empire, published in 1960 in Les Fêtes et Cérémonies au temps de Charles Quint. Yates acknowledges Jacot's initiative in bringing together gatherings of European scholars to study the European phenomenon of court festival and other pageantry, to which she attributes much of the revival of interest in these subjects. Those are her words. And she adds, I hope that Jacot will view the present volume as in some sense an outcome of the Anglo-French cooperation in scholarship which he encouraged. Allardyce Nicholl, founding director of the Shakespeare Institute at the University of Birmingham, realized the importance of the material gathered by Jacot in a volume of well over 30 essays on festivals, Les Fêtes de la Renaissance, études réunies et présentées, and published in 1956. Nicholl reviewed the collection in Shakespeare Quarterly in 1958. To quote this review, such shows were ephemeral, and that perhaps explains why they have not yet received the full attention and detailed scrutiny which they deserve. As Jacot observes in his introduction, these festivals, these entries, despite their seemingly flimsy and fleeting quality, go deep into the life of the time. They had indeed a deep significance. About them hovered an aura of religion, of ritual, of ceremonial. In them, symbolism and allegory were predominant, and all of the arts combined in an effort to enrich their content. Words of Allardyce Nicholl. He went on to note that one section of Jacot's volume is composed of historical accounts based on documentary evidence of particular shows, and that most of these offer new historical material, while a second group concerns emblematic symbolic concepts and themes. Nicholl was to review, too, Jacot's edited collection published in 1960, also in Paris, Les Fêtes et Cérémonies au temps de Charles Quint. In his review of this volume in Shakespeare Quarterly in 1962, he wrote, much new information has been presented here concerning the entertainments organised in diverse countries during Charles's reign, and these have been excellently set against their philosophical political background, revealed in emblem and symbol. Nicholl, as Frances Yates had done, understood the importance of these entertainments as part of the wider context in which Shakespeare and his contemporaries were working. There is much more to discover in Yates's short preface to Australia, notably her reasoning behind the inclusion of 44 black and white plates, some with up to 4 images within them, and 2 figures. She wrote, "The illustrations are not presented as art history, nor are they picture book history. They are inseparable from the argument in the text, but do not so much illustrate the text as state the same argument in another medium." The inclusion of evidence, as in the appendices of Estrella and of Roystrong's Art and Power, the later offering a calendar of major festival events and publications, 1494 to 1641, and genealogical tables indicating the familial and dynastic connections across the ruling houses of Europe, as well as an end gathering of 115 illustrations, made clear just how much more there was to be done. Roystrong, like Sidney Anglo, had studied for his doctorate under Frances Yates, as of course had Margaret McGowan, whose thesis was subsequently published as L'Art du Ballet de Cour en France, 1581 to 1643. Margaret has continued to make more texts and documents available to researchers, including materials on l'entrée de Henri II à Rouen in 1550, published in 1974, on the Ballet Comique de la Royne, 1581, published in 1982, and on the costume designs of the court ballets of Louis XIII, published as a catalogue for the V&A in 1989. She was also, of course, an editor of the journal Dance Research. The activities of the Graduate School of Renaissance Studies at Warwick and its development into a centre for the study of the Renaissance in the 1990s valued similar collaborations and connections to those developed at the Warburg Institute. We too produced a journal, nowhere near as grand, Renaissance Drama Newsletter and its supplements, and later the Renaissance Journal, to keep in touch with a much wider group of scholars than might otherwise have been possible before the development of digital networking, and to share details of research projects and conferences. We too developed links across different disciplines and countries, including an Erasmus postgraduate student exchange with the University of Venice Ca' and with the Centre de Recherche Interdisciplinaire sur la Renaissance at the University of Paris-Sorbonne, directed by Mary-Thérèse Jones-Davis and Marie-Madeleine Martinet. With the latter, our collaboration extended to participation in a series of annual colloques, subsequently printed. Doctoral students in the Graduate School at Warwick were supervised by 2 colleagues from different departments to encourage the development of cross-disciplinary research. We valued too collaborations with librarians and archivists, as well as gallery and museum directors, curators, and performance practitioners. Early honorary professors included Nikolai Rubinstein, Muriel Bradbrook, former mistress of Girton College, Cambridge, and Ronnie's doctoral supervisor, and J.B. Trapp. A series of conferences, some in collaboration with the Shakespeare Institute, some with Tours, with the University of Columbia, New York, and the Center for the Study of the Book, offered opportunities for the exchange of ideas and for visiting speakers and researchers at all levels. Our visitors included the historians Eric Ives and R.J. Knecht, as well as Margaret McGowan and Stephen Orgel, and performance practitioners and exhibition curators. Some of the conferences led to the development of publications, which usually depended upon visual as well as written argument of the kind so valued by Frances Yates. But meanwhile, the fashion for grand narratives across cultures and civilizations gradually gave way to more focused research, drilling down into the detail of urban, rural, courtly and religious lives, as well as to the complexities of such phenomena as festivals. By the late 1990s, our focus on Renaissance festivals at Warwick had developed in response to what had become a clear need to provide more access to the evidence underpinning that research. Helen Watanabe O'Kelly, Professor of German Literature at Exeter College, Oxford, had for many years been interested in German court cultures, publishing triumphal shows, tournaments at German-speaking courts in their European context in 1992. She delivered a paper at the Warwick Conference in 1998 on the importance of a major source of information on court festivals of the Renaissance and early modern periods. The up until then somewhat underestimated festival books. Stephen Orgel delivered a paper on court masks at the same occasion. In 1999, with Pierre Béard, Helen Watanabe O'Kelly edited Spectaculum Europaeum, Theatre and Spectacle in Europe, 1580 to 1750. In her review of this volume for Dance Research, Margaret McGowan wrote, "This massive, heavy handbook brings together a group of collaborators from diverse countries to provide an up-to-date and fairly comprehensive survey of our knowledge and its limitations of the festivals performed across Europe in early modern times, to indicate primary and secondary sources for further work, and to identify areas which require more research." Helen followed this up with a further publication in 2000, co-edited with Anne Simon, Festivals and Ceremonies, a bibliography of works relating to court, civic and religious festivals in Europe, 1500 to 1800. This identified in 4 major collections at the British Library, the V&A, the Getty Institute and the Spencer Collection at the New York Public Library, between 3,000 and 4,000 festival books in 13 languages. The 1998 conference at Warwick was to become the forerunner of research which led to 2 initiatives. One specifically funded by the AHRB as a resource enhancement project, and the other as part of the AHRC-funded Centre for the Study of Renaissance Elites and Court Cultures, hosted at Warwick from 1999 to 2004. The first of these was directed by Ronnie Mulrine and myself. It involved the digitisation of more than 250 festival books in the collection of the British Library, with introductions and commentary accessible from beginner level to senior scholars as part of the British Library's Treasures in Full website. Most of the hands-on preparation of the books for digitisation, including selection and cataloguing, were done by Dr. Sarah Cusk and Dr. Alexander Sampson, now of course at UCL. Then research fellows associated with the Centre for the Study of the Renaissance, with input from Dr. Christian Jensen and a team from the British Library. A steering group of academic colleagues, Helen Watanabe O'Kelly, Margaret McGowan, R.J. Knecht, Karen Friedrich, Richard Parker, librarian for Renaissance Studies at Warwick, in addition to Ronnie Mulrine and myself, provided guidance and liaison with Dr. Jensen and his colleagues. Dr. Thomas Stecker of the Herzog August Bibliothek at Wolfenbüttel gave valuable advice on the thesaurus of search terms and arranged for links between this site and that of the Herzog August Bibliothek, itself holding a rich collection of festival texts. The Warwick BL site includes links to both the Herzog August Bibliothek and, of course, to the library at the Warburg Institute. In 2000, Ronnie led a UNESCO conference with Helen Watanabe O'Kelly, funded by the ESF in Tuscany, leading to a volume edited by himself and Elizabeth Goldring on court festivals at the European Renaissance, Art, Politics and Performance, published by Ashgate in 2002. A further UNESCO conference in Tuscany followed, in collaboration with Jill Berkler, again of the Herzog August Bibliothek. Meanwhile, Margaret McGowan published 2 major book-length studies on festivals in the early years of the 21st century. The Vision of Rome in the French Renaissance, for Yale in 2000, and Dance in the Renaissance, European Fashion, French Obsession for Yale again in 2008. Helen Watanabe-O'Kelly published Court Culture in Dresden, From Renaissance to Baroque for Palgrave in 2002. What you're seeing, I think, is a series of collaborations and flurries of research that come from collective institutes. The AHRC-funded centre included as one of its main research initiatives, I've written this on the slide, I'm sorry, a collaboration of a team including 38 scholars from a range of disciplines and a range of different countries who worked together towards a major collection of 44 festival texts in their original languages and in translation into English, with introductions, commentaries, and illustrations. This was published by Ashgate with funding support from the MIHRA in 2004 in a large format 2-volume collection, Europa Triumphans, Court and Civic Festivals in Early Modern Europe, with Ronnie Morine, Helen Watanabe-O'Kelly and myself as general editors, and Elizabeth Goldring and Sarah Knight as associate editors. Throughout that process, J.D. Trapp was a hugely supported member of our steering group, hosting meetings at the Warburg. And our advisory board for the centre was chaired by Nicholas Mann and included Keith Thomas. So you can see that the circle grew considerably. By 2008, it seemed important to move beyond the initial phase of locating and documenting resources for festivals research and making these more widely available to students and scholars. And we looked again for research funding to take the next step towards a more analytical and critical analysis of the significance of festivals in different contexts, now drawing on the resources that have been uncovered. In March 2010, we held an ESF-funded exploratory workshop on the future of research in Renaissance festivals, resources and collaborations. I convened the occasion, hosted at Warwick's base in Venice, the Palazzo Pesaro Papafava, and attended by 16 contributors from 7 countries, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Sweden, the USA, and the UK, and across a range of disciplines. Professional backgrounds spanned academic, library and archive, museum and gallery specialisms. Outcomes included a collaboration with another ESF network, colloquium, with a focus on court residences as places of exchange in late medieval and early modern Europe, 1400 to 1700, and the founding of the Society for European Festivals Research, co-convened by Ronnie Morine, Margaret McGowan and myself, with regular conferences in Tours, Warwick and Venice, at the Warburg in Bergamo and Mons, and at Trinity Hall in Cambridge, and leading to an equally collaborative process, our publication series of festival studies, 1450 to 1700, initially published by Ashgate, with co-general editors Ronnie, Margaret and myself. As many of you will be aware, and it colours all that I say today, Ronnie died at the end of January this year. He will be greatly missed by all of us who have been concerned with the development of festivals, teaching, research and publication. I suspect that his enthusiasm could be said to have been as inspirational as that of Frances Yates. Many of his doctoral students have been a part of our more recent work, conferences and publications. Ronnie will always be remembered as a founding editor of the European Festival Studies series. He helped us to navigate a transfer of already commissioned volumes in the series to Routledge, following the sale of Ashgate to Taylor and Francis, of which Routledge is of course an imprint, and our more recent transfer still to Brepols last year, in order to secure the long-term quality of volumes, including numerous illustrations, so essential to the analysis of festivals throughout our period. Among Ronnie's last tasks was that of encouraging our long-time collaborator, Marie-Claude Canova-Green, to join Margaret McGowan and myself as a new co-general editor of the series, and the encouragement of a number of younger as well as established scholars, curators and archivists to be part of the series Publications Advisory Board. Ronnie was active too in planning our next conferences, Turin, September this year, Versailles 2020, and Coventry to mark its year as UK City of Culture 2021. He would so much have enjoyed being here today. What I hope has become increasingly clear is that the study of Renaissance festivals, so important in the work of Frances Yates, has continued to flourish. As she understood, it requires cross-disciplinary research and access to original documents and images, as well as teams willing to put aside their differences to share their findings at conferences and in publications. Recently, digital resources have extended access to a wide range of materials from major library connections and other databases, contributing to the evolution now possible in the study of European Renaissance festivals and their political, religious, social, economic, and cultural sources and influences. And it's seen too now in relation to an increasingly global context. Much still needs to be done to analyse and discuss festivals, including details of the spaces in which they took place and their performance characteristics, temporary architecture, scenography, scripts, music, dance, costumes, processions, fireworks, and the creative teams of craftsmen and women who facilitated the occasions, whether in indoor or outdoor, urban or court locations. Just a brief afterword. Towards the end of the First World War, and in the years when Frances Yates was in her late teens and early 20s, the poet and playwright Jean Cocteau contributed scenarios to two ballets in Paris, Parade and Les Mariés de la Tour Eiffel, in which he and a team of creatives, and these are the words of Rosalie Goldberg writing on his work, anticipated a new mixed media genre in French performance, which would remain on the edges of theatre, ballet, light opera, contemporary dance, and art. The two works were Cocteau's responses and that of his team to the absurdity of war and of contemporary society more broadly. I mention them here because they marked a shift described by Cocteau as away from a tradition of poetry in theatre, seen as separately, to poetry of theatre, in which the experience of the whole event was part of its message. They depended for their realization on what Cocteau described, again in his words, as a friendly group of collaborators, each skilled in their own field. I find myself thinking about festival studies and the strength of scholarship to cross boundaries. Thank you.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Right. Well, I first met Clement Armstrong, or Ormston as he was then known, towards the end of 1955. Frances Yates was responsible. I'd only recently started on my research into the court festivals of Henry VIII and was based at the old Warburg Library in the Imperial Institute in South Kensington, which I still think of as the real Warburg Institute. Charles Mitchell introduced me to Frances Yates, who was, he assured me in awed tones, the queen of the subject, he said. So I met her and she suggested that I might start by writing something on the meeting between Henry VIII and Francis I of the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520. Of course, I've seen reproductions of this famous painting, which I'm sure pretty well all of you will know quite well, but I did wonder whether it had any value at all as a record of the occasion. So there you are, that was the picture. And I thought I'd go a little further into its authenticity. And that's how I encountered Ormston. He cropped up in a series of letters from the increasingly agitated commissioners in charge of the King's temporary palace at Guildford. I quote, "And Richard Gibson, who should cover the roofs with seared canvas, is not yet coming, and it's high time his works are in hand, for it must be painted on the outside and after curiously be garnished under with knots and batons, gilt and other devices, which business is committed to John Rastell, Clement Ormston and other. These works be of great and importunate charges, and we be in doubt how they shall overcome the same by the day appointed." The commissioners next expressed their hope that the building would be completed by the last day of May, so that, again I quote, "John Rastell, Clement Ormston and John Brown, the King's painters, do make and garnish all the roofs sufficiently by the same day, which is a marvellous great charge and business, for the roofs be large and stately. Moreover, Ormston's estimate of the costs for the roofs," I quote again, "is a marvellous great sum of money, but it had to be provided so that the King be not disappointed of his roofs." In fact, the builders and decorators did complete their work on time, and their building was considered to be the 8th wonder of the world. Indeed, said one Italian observer, Leonardo himself couldn't have done better. As a historical source, my starting point, the Hampton Court painting is something of a curate's egg, good in parts. But as far as I can tell, the rendering of the English temporary palace, which is obviously there, that's King's Castle, the rendering of the palace seems to me to be a fairly accurate reconstruction and is almost certainly based upon sketches made at the time. It's not true of other parts of the picture, but it is true of the palace. There it is. That's the palace. And this roof is the nearest we'll ever get to an original piece of decor by Clement Ormston. It's a great pity that we have no pictorial record of the roundhouse at Calais, a magnificent masking theatre built for the entertainment of Charles V, the Emperor, and Henry VIII, which was to follow immediately after the Field of Cloth of Gold, and was built and decorated by the same team of artists and craftsmen. Similarly, we have no pictorial record of the banquet hall and theatre built at Greenwich in 1527, when once again Rastell, Brown and Ormston were called into service, and where Holbein painted a celestial ceiling under the instructions of Nicholas Kratzer, the King's astronomer. On all of these occasions, Ormston, in addition to a variety of decorations, was especially concerned with the lighting arrangements. He had a very varied and rather unorthodox career. He was admitted as a freeman of the Grocers' Company in 1502, but he doesn't reappear until the Field of Cloth of Gold, when, as we've seen, he was a grocer no longer. Thereafter, apart from the court revels, he was involved in various prestigious decorative building projects, including the provision of bullions and buds of timber, dead leaves and antique work at Whitehall Palace in 1532. And we know that he was dead by May 1536, but his will was true. We know something of his work as a rebels artist. beyond that roof, and that his speciality seems to have been the provision of fanciful lighting, the pageant of the dancing lights, it was called, which were costumed wickerwork figures bearing torches and which illuminated the theatres of Calais and Greenwich. And we know that he was professionally and personally involved with, associated with, an interesting circle of colleagues, who all rose to positions of rather greater significance, both socially and within the court orbit. There was John Brown, the King's painter, Richard Gibson, Sergeant of the Tents, whose detailed financial records remain the principal source for our knowledge of Henry VIII's court revels. But most important of all, there was John Rastell, Thomas More's brother-in-law, playwright, printer, MP, would-be explorer, cosmographer, and a Reformation zealot. But in addition to Urmston's work for court revels and for high-class building projects, we do have a remarkable corpus of political, social, economic, and religious material written by him. Because in the early 1530s, as England was moving towards a break with the Roman Church, he was moved to put pen to paper to express his violent views on almost all the controversial subjects of the day. But it's noticeable that those few scholars who ever troubled their heads about Urmston had, until very recently, concentrated upon the three short treatises on economic and social affairs which had been readily available since Heinrich Pauli published them in 1878. And so it's come about that Urmston's views on these practical and material matters have been regularly commented upon. They deal with things that are readily understood and easy to discuss. But scholars have only recently started to come to grips with the rambling, incoherent, 354-page scroll of Urmston's manuscript collection entitled Sermons and Declarations Against Popish Ceremonies, which is submitted without success to Thomas Cromwell, and which is preserved in what used to be known as the public record of it. And here, at last, we come to what I'm sure you've all been waiting for, Clement Urmston's flatulent rhapsodies. Now, that's how Geoffrey Elton dismissed his writings. Repetitive and flatulent rhapsodies, he sneered, and this remark wasn't really unjust. Stylistically, the tracts are rambling, incoherent, painfully repetitive, and syntactically often quite inextricable. Yet even the most shapeless and windy matters may contain original ideas which are worth pursuing, though trying to make sense of them poses a fundamental historiographical problem. Can we avoid the error of selecting out just those fragments which suit our purposes in order to make what is essentially disconnected and eccentric into something orderly and comprehensible? Historians do this all the time, but I'm not sure that it is justifiable. I'll do my best, of course, but I may end up no more intelligible than Urmston himself. He evidently developed into a man of many obsessions, and these, stirred by strong social and religious impulses, became inextricably jumbled in his mind. Probably the most far-reaching of these obsessions was his concern with the relationship between kingship on earth and the rule of the sun, moon, and stars in the heavens. But this was mixed up with political and even architectural anthropomorphism, with the king as both son, head of state, head of the church, and provider of spiritual and earthly sustenance for his people. Most important of all, perhaps, was some wholly original, even revolutionary suggestions as to how all this could be made into a practical policy to facilitate the break with Rome. The laws of God, which terms of, in the form of light of sun and moon and stars over all the laws of the world. And for him, the sun is the central point of the universe. It is the point between the earthly man and the heavenly man. That is, between the laws of God, first taught to Adam by faith, and the laws of this world, which were made by reason, or by man's reason rather, and which had prevailed since Adam's sin. Now the king has mystic qualities bestowed upon him by the holy unction. He is an earthly man, but with the ability to rise above earthly things, so that, being inwardly moved by the grace of God, he can not only understand the heavenly laws, but can also help to apply them in this world. All of this is not merely symbolized in the king's seal, it is actually comprised therein. Ordinary folk have to work for their daily meat, but this living, literally, food and remunerative labour, doesn't come as a gift directly from God, but must be provided by the king, who should lead his people to material and thence to spiritual well-being. The king must see himself to be a right head lord in God, to give livings to all his people, and must, out of the earthly man, rise into the heavenly man in spirit above the sun. It's all very convoluted, but one can see how Ormston's socio-economic theory derives from this mystic conception of kingship, not the other way round. He has a wholly anthropomorphic view of what is literally the body politic. The king is the head. His advisors, lords, knights, and esquires growing out from beneath his shoulders are his arms, hands, and fingers, just as such limbs are part of an earthly man's body. All these parts must work together for the common weal, and there are, in the main, two sorts of labour necessary: husbandry and artificiality. Yet, unfortunately, there are some people who have striven for riches without considering the common good. And in particular, Ormston attacks lawyers whose wealth derives from people's distress and the prior commitment of sin, and merchants who make their money out of scarcity while carrying riches out of the kingdom. The commonweal has thus decayed because many people do not have labour and livings given to them, but are forced to do the best they can on their own. It's the king's task to supply this need and so lead his people away from earthly sin. Ormston's diagnosis of socio-economic ills is not really all that much less sophisticated than what our pundits tell us now, but he is extremely confused both in his corporeal and astronomical metaphors for the common weal. And here I've got to go a little slow. The sun, as well as being the point between earthly and heavenly things, is also God's great broad seal of his right and mercy, that is the sun, sol justitiae, the light of this world. Just as the sun is the head among the heavenly bodies, giving light and life to earthly things, so the king is the son of man, with his dual position embodied in his head seal, the image of the king's body being in this world, but with his head in the heavens and in God's laws. It is at this point, in a really rather forlorn effort to make his idea more comprehensible, that Ormston hits upon a remarkable figure. And here is a rather obscure clue for you to ponder. This is one of Henry VIII's armours. What is it to do with the king's head in the heavens? Nothing, except that it enables us to establish that Henry was nearly 6'1.5" tall, in an age when the average height of his subjects would have been about 5'6". Ormston must certainly have seen the mighty figure of the king quite often, so that when he kept drawing upon the story of King Saul to demonstrate how the king's head is in the heavens, I think it's clear of whom he's thinking. Saul was a choice young man and a goodly, whom God chosen to be the first king of Israel. From the shoulders upward, he was higher than all the people from the shoulder and above. And so was Henry VIII. Now, this roundabout route brings Ormston to what he believed to be his most important suggestion for promoting the Reformation in England. The king's mystic significance is expressed in his head seal, that is literally a seal with the royal head depicted thereon. And in this, quote, "The form of God's law shall be present in his own person, wheresoever he goes, and rule, signifying he hath the grace of God with him, anointed with God's Holy Spirit." From this great seal, in Ormston's view, there should be lesser seals for the head houses over all the bodies of the shires. These, suggests Ormston, must seal in wax for recording the causes of right of the realm. And from them, there are to be sent out lesser head seals to the head houses of every parish and cure within the church, which shall be sealed, print, parchment, and paper with ink on little charge. Every householder is to have such a seal in parchment every Easter, and is to keep it with him for the whole year, wheresoever he ride or go, to record with him how he liveth in cure. Only servants and others who are not householders will be without these seals, but even they must live under the cure of those who do possess them. Since man sinned, nobody is able to receive the gift of grace from God, but must receive it from the King, God's minister, whose powers and the heavenly office are represented in the seal, which thus, in Ormston's view, combines an explicitly magical, talismanic value with the practical function of an identity card authenticating the bearer's loyalty. Ormston was especially keen that the king himself should be aware of his own mystic powers and his exceptional privileges. And there was a very practical reason behind this. The king, Ormston asserts, has been so blinded by the teaching of man and by earthly laws that he has been vexed and troubled more than all the other kings of Christendom in the outlay of the riches of his realm for the Pope's maintenance. Something in excess of £3 million, one ways and another, has been spent in this manner. Moreover, the English people have been disturbed by the Pope and his minions, whose laws are inconsistent and hostile to the king's spiritual powers, which they claim for themselves. They say that they are the lords of the bodies and souls of all the peoples, but, argued Ormston, the Pope's laws are of this world under the sun. And one cannot put away sin by the application of laws which arise from that sin. The king, therefore, should take all the souls and bodies of his people into his own cure, because the Pope has failed to make the people better inwardly, despite cloaking his wickedness with an appearance of holiness. The cloak thereof is an old, despised, foul, bawdy coat, shamefully arrayed and spotted with sin. Yet, if this vile garment is removed, the people will think themselves stark naked, unless the king demonstrates his ability to undertake the cure for his subject. The Pope is not without support for his claims. The Emperor, with his vast accretion of territories, is in league with him, and together they are determined that there must never be a general council in which the realms of Christendom would take Christ as their head. The Pope claims to be head of the Church, but this is really the King's position. And here Ormston parallels his view of the significance of the royal seal by developing an interesting extension of medieval architectural symbolism. Arguing from an identification of the cruciform church with the figure of man, Ormston maintains that the head part of the church is the choir, and that this represents the king's office. But the Pope and his ministers have taken away the choir from all churches and so destroyed the head office of Christian kings. Here he is obviously thinking of the chancel screen, which did literally cut off the choir from the main body of the church, and thus, to this thinker's right way of believing things, it severed the king from his subject. It is up to the king to assert his own authority, which is God's law, and Ormston advocates that this should be done without any argument or explanation. The king should simply take all his subjects into his cure, and should leave not one soul to live under no cure but Pope's law. Well, his ideas and analogues to these ideas, his general view of the body politic is conventional enough, but this anthropomorphic view of church architecture seems more idiosyncratic, unknown in some ways. Of course, the idea that churches were structured like the human body with the chancel as the head was widely accepted, and Giordano Bruno's classic statement in the 13th century was well known. The chancel is architecturally the head of a church building. You're all familiar with Frances Yates, Martini, and of course later, 50 years ago, but still the same idea, Pietro Castelli, were the church and well, it's obvious. But Ormston takes this fairly commonplace idea and characteristically treats the chancel as the king's head, so that architecturally the rood screen imposes not only a spiritual but also a political decapitation. More striking still is Ormston's constantly reiterated notion concerning the king's seal, where in the upper third is the king's head in the sun. This could be simply a figure derived from the royal seal, but two of Henry VIII's great seals are more obviously solar. That's solar enough, as you can see. And here again. Surely at some time Ormston must have seen such images and pondered their cosmic significance. And could he have been influenced by his rebels colleague John Rastell, who was deeply interested in the sun, moon, and stars and the elements, and displayed this enthusiasm in his well-known printer's device? Ormston must have seen this too and thought about it. But none of this really explains his persistent solar imagery in relation to the king's seal, where he seems to be not dealing with a metaphor, but with actuality. The seal isn't just a symbol, it has mystic power, it is talismanic, it is theurgic, and so, it seems, is Ormston's king. Now, the sources for all this worried me in the 1950s. And despite having made another attempt at the problem, they worry me still. I've even been tempted to try my hand at a bit of wild Warburg and browse through the various sources for talismanic magic, solar and cosmic kingship in the ancient world, and so on. It's a game we can all play. Here, for example, we have a series of terracotta clipper showing the radiant head of Helios, the sun in the middle of the heavens. And they have a bronze portrait of Caracalla, which is very suggestive. Or there's a different, a miniature of the anointment of David, where he's shown lifted on the clippers with 2 stars indicating his conquering function. And of course, he's being anointed. Now, of course, we could pile up examples such as these, and we could drag in all the usual suspects: the Hermetica, the Picadrus, Dionysius Areopagiticus, Ticino, Pico, Titinius, Rachlin, Agrippa. There's no lack of thought-provoking, even contiguous material. It is contiguous. But it seems quite impossible, as I found it so, to relate any of it to an early 16th century English grocer, joiner, painter and pamphleteer of somewhat uncertain literacy. Way back in 1946, another of my old mentors, Professor S.T. Binder, published a brief biography of Armstrong, which is still cited as authoritative. And he concluded it thus, quote, Armstrong, you knew him, Armstrong had something to say, and if he could not say it with war's art or Latimer's verb, that is because he was a more typical Englishman. Indeed, it might with some justice be claimed that in him every man was made ungracefully yet sincerely articulate. I don't know about that. I don't know how to talk. An anthropomorphic view of church architecture, arguing that the rood screen cut off the king's head from the body of his people, but without any concern for the obscuring of the sacred rites of the altar. Anthropomorphic with political theory, well, that's common enough. Talismanic seal, solar apotheosis. Was this really the voice of every man? The problem is, and for me always has been, where did Emerson get his idea? Frances Yates was puzzled, and she vaguely murmured something about the Kabbalah, but she couldn't suggest a precise congruity nor any identifiable direct source. I asked Ernst Gongri, but he simply suggested that we ask Otto Kurz. Kurz knows everything, he said. But he didn't know the answer to my question. And so I asked you, does anybody have any idea? It's now well over 60 years too late for my thesis, but I still like to have some answer. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll have questions and perhaps some answers.
Now?
No, afterwards, after you're doing. Paul, could somebody pass these around? Stand out. Our next speaker in this session is another old friend, Dilwyn Knox, who is Emeritus Professor of the School of European Languages, Culture and Society at UCL. He has the very great distinction of being one of our 2 first ever Frances Yates long-term fellows. And he also is the co-author with Charles Schmidt of a Warburg Institute survey and was served the Institute in many capacities, including as a member of the Advisory Council. He works in various areas of Renaissance studies, philosophy, learning, education, and cosmology, and particularly on Marsilio Ficino, Copernicus, and Giordano Bruno. He wrote the entry on Bruno in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and is now writing a volume outlining the essential features of Bruno's philosophy. and he's going to speak to us on Frances Yates and Giordano Bruno. Over to you, Joe.
I've got a
Weave in.
you have a quick display, I think.
Yeah, you just have to, it's on there, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think I want to really begin by saying a word of gratitude to Frances Yates for having made it possible for me to study as a Frances Yates Fellow at the Warburg Institute. I would not be here now with you if it were not for her. It's quite as simple as that. There's no, I want to ask you whether we can get to keep this. Am I audible? That's at the back. Is that okay? Yeah. Thank you. The name of Yates and Bruno are intertwined, and so it was obviously appropriate that somebody should speak on Bruno, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity of being able to do so. I'm just going to say about 2 or 3 things about, first of all, how she came to be interested in Bruno, how she developed her thesis on Bruno, a very distinctive thesis, or I should really say theses, because there's really more than one of one thesis, and then explain what was novel about it, what the reaction to it was, and then try to sort out amongst the criticisms that it received what can be saved and what really needs to be adjusted, in my view, of course. So let me begin just by saying something. I think about 2/3 of what I say will be very old hat to most of you. But the first thing that needs to be said is Frances Yates, when she first studied, learned about, read about in the informal education, or largely informal education that she had, followed a very typical Burkhardian line, seen through the filter of Pater, of other English authors like Symonds, who relayed a Burkhardian type of Renaissance, and then obviously the English literature or pre-Raphaelite element to it all as well, such as in Browning or other poets besides. During this part of her introduction to the Renaissance, the name Bruno probably did not really appear. It was a literary and visual Renaissance rather than a philosophical one, which is also true of course, Burckhardt himself. But Bruno was not a major figure. No one actually heard about the name, but probably didn't trouble to venture into the undergrowth of the Renaissance, where Bruno was lurking. So, when did she in fact discover about this strange, what she called initially great Italian philosopher, an epithet that really reveals that she didn't know who he was, it was just a kind of standard term that was used to describe him. When did she first begin to come across this man? She tells the story herself, again, I'm sure you've heard this before, that she was rummaging around in the public record office and she came across a document concerning Michel de Castelnau. And this was a testimonial, a letter of reference, so to speak, for John Florian. This kind of thing that most of us here have written 1,000 times, letters of reference, and this one happens to be for John Florian. Of course, we know who John Florian is, and here is Michel de Castelnau, a rather wonderful man, I think. I think he's actually the man I would like to meet, more than any other, strangely enough, but he's neither here nor there very much for our story. Bruno has come to London. He's been sent there by the French king, and he's been lodged with the French ambassador, and he's teaching the young daughters of Michel de Castelnau, the French ambassador to Queen Elizabeth's court. He's teaching them Italian. But as I think about this, this is quite extraordinary. If you've read any Bruno, you know that Bruno's Italian is a rather extraordinary thing, and the thought of him teaching 2 young ladies his Italian is rather extraordinary thought, but we leave that to be. Florian had also been teaching them, and they got to know each other. And in fact, there's good reason to believe that Florio's dictionary, Italian, two dictionaries, Italian-English dictionaries, had a very large, substantial component of Bruno himself in. In fact, Florio had never been to Italy. He must have asked Bruno on several occasions, what does this word mean? And Bruno then filled it in. The reason for saying this is that because if you read Bruno's works, Italian works, you find the best translations of what Bruno means in Florio's dictionary. So the two men knew each other, got to know each other, and Frances Yates was working on all of this and got more fascinated by this strange figure. The outcome was, as you know, a very learned article about Florio, followed by an equally learned book on John Florio, which Giordano Bruno plays a large role. Now, the reason why Bruno plays a large role in Florio isn't just because of the dictionary and the common temporary jobs as tutors to the two young daughters of Castello, but also because Florio plays a large role in the Cena delle Cene, the Ash Wednesday Supper, the book for which Bruno is perhaps best known, the first of the 6 philosophical dialogues that he wrote while he was in London. I've given you some rough dates on the screen. So he publishes this book shortly after his arrival in 1584. And in this book, which is dedicated to Castello, we have a wonderful account of how Florio and Bruno and 2 other people desperately tried to get from the Italian embassy, which is in Salisbury Court. I don't know how I can point this to you, it is there, and it's marked. It's up there, just above my finger. You can see some words running downwards, and that says Salisbury Court. They tried to get to Salisbury Court, to Whitehall, to the palace, and they decide they're going to be clever and get a taxi, that is a ferry, and go by boat to Whitehall. The ferry turns out to be a complete disaster. They then try to get off, which again proves problematic, and there are lots of allusions to Kerem and Dante and this, that and the other. They then fall into a bog when they arrive. The whole thing is just slapstick. I'm emphasizing this part of it all because if you know, if you read Yates's works, you see what rather fascinates her is theatre and its political content. So the Ash Wednesday Supper is not just a philosophical dialogue with a bit of slapstick. For Yates, it represented something, kind of a theatre in itself, and it is, a lot of it is just theatre, which there must be, just as there had been for her dissertation, which she'd written about the French theatre and its political content, and she was to do successfully later on in her life in an analysis of, say, Shakespeare's plays. There must be some kind of hidden message in it all. So when Yates reads this dialogue, she's thinking to herself, underneath all of this rather strange goings on, this strange theatre that I'm reading about, there must be some political message behind it all. At this point in her book on Florio, she isn't going to venture very much. She called that book and her articles of this period, 1930s, 1920s, perfectly orthodox bits of research, so rather dismissing what she had written in her early period. To us, many of us, we might rather think otherwise. This is perhaps the most solid piece of her research. That's not my personal view, but they are still certainly studies of books and articles that can be mined for the information that they are, as she says, pieces of scholarly research that have retained their value to this day. Her work on Florio is still the standard reference book on the subject. And I should say too, at this point, in light of what I'm going to say later on, her books, even the most, shall we say, adventurous, even the most adventurous of them contain extraordinary amounts of information that remain useful. So Bruno, even if you do not agree with her interpretation of Bruno, you'll find lots of things that many people have not noticed before. So they're still very valuable pieces of research. I shan't have been the first person who's ever thought that they found a wonderful nugget of Bruno, and then only found with a slight sort of Italian swear word or two that she got there first 40 years ago. And other people may not have noticed it, or whatever it is, often not. So, I mean, irrespective of whatever one might drink water, what one might want to say about her later works, they still remain valuable resources, just as her Florio books, Florio articles, and other articles of this earlier period remain so to today. Just excuse me, but have a drink of water. Does this get recorded too? Well, that part of the story, I'm sure, is known to you, and also the line that she herself gave, that Florio led her to Bruno, and Bruno led her to the Warburg Institute. That's already been mentioned, in fact, by Elizabeth this morning. The first contacts with Wind, and then subsequently Saxo and Bing, encouraged her in her interest in Giordano Bruno, amongst other things, I hasten to add. And in fact, Wind is, shall we say, the evil genius, I believe, behind much of what, it's perhaps a bit too far, but anyway, the genius, doubtful, shall we say, the evil genius behind some of Yates's interpretation, as I'll perhaps just outline in a moment. Now, she wrote some further articles. I don't know if the handout that I made, or John made, has been circulated, but it's not very important. It has listed some of the pieces that she wrote. The task that she set herself at the Warburg after 10 or so years of being there was to translate the dialogue that I've just been talking about, the Ash Wednesday Supper, and to write a study of it. It's a challenging task, and many others, including myself, have come to grief on this because it is a complicated thing to understand and explain. And a copy of the work that she wrote is still in the Warburg Institute. I haven't had a chance to see it. I've been in Italy recently, but I shall be looking at it on Friday, and I hope some cloud of wonderful knowledge will suddenly descend upon me. But I do know roughly what the contents are, because she canonized the introduction into two articles, two quite famous articles, one which concerned Bruno's time at Oxford, and the other which describes the political religious policy of Bruno while he was in London during these 2 years, 1583 to 1585. The book, which she submitted to Cambridge University Press, came to a very sorry end. The syndics refused to publish it, and Wind consoled her with the idea that this book, this proposal, this interpretation of Acemi was far too adventurous for conservative scholars. And so well she might. I have now tried to explain one or two things about her interpretation. To try and summarize a rather complicated argument about a rather complicated author, and a complicated author and a complicated theme in 2 minutes. What Yates wanted to explain, or her main objective, was to propose an Irenic version, interpretation of transubstantiation and of the Mass in L'Acemi degli Cemi. I put it to you in that rather extraordinary form because if you know the book and if you know Bruno, the first thing you know about him is that L'Acemi degli Cemi is famous because it is a proposal about the Copernican cosmos and its significance for understanding the universe as a whole, which is infinite, composed of an infinite number of Copernican cosmoses, and this qualifies Bruno as being one of the great early thinkers paving the way to a new conception of the universe, of science, of reason and philosophy. And yet, I told you now, Yates wants to say it's a book about the mass. So we have two rather extraordinarily divergent interpretations. You can well understand how those poor, grey, conservative scholars from the Cambridge University board must have decided that this was just a little bit too far from what they understood to be the truth. So what exactly was she proposing? Well, the idea, as I say, basically is to prove that the book is about the mass that will be acceptable to both Protestants and Catholics, in line with the mission of Michel de Castelnau, the ambassador, who is trying to reconcile Elizabeth and Henri III to marry and to overcome their religious differences. Of course, the Mass, the Eucharist, is one of the great problems, dividing two confessions, two religions, and so Bruno set himself the task of showing that there wasn't really very much of a difference between the two interpretations, so please marry each other. That, in essence, is what the book is. How can you do such an extraordinary thing? Well, you explain that the universe is alive. It's a huge, animate, infinite, animate organism. Everything in it is alive and is also the manifestation of God. So that simply everything, even this lampshade, is part of this great epiphany, including even the host that I, as a priest, will now offer to you, must be alive, and God is immanent in that. So, we've done it. We've proved that the host is animate, it's God present, and so now we can go on with the marriage of the two, the Queen and the King. This is a passage that, no, I won't read this at all. So, if we now, well, I don't think I need to go into more detail on that subject. Let me now pass on to the next phase in our thinking about Bruno after publishing the article that is cannibalization of her book, or at least the introduction to her study of Latina. Let me pass on now to the kind of second version of Giordano Bruno. So what we've got at the moment is still a kind of Catholic interpretation. She insisted on the word Catholic in this early interpretation. This was a kind of to prove that there was a presence of God in things, but it was of such a kind of expansive kind that any Protestant would be forced to agree with it, so there wasn't any great reason, doctrinal reason, to refuse to accept it. She now moved on to a second version, in which the emphasis becomes on Hermes Trismegistus, the ancient Egyptian sage, to which she'd been introduced by Walker, a little bit more of which later, not just Walker, but I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And she wanted to show that it wasn't just that the universe was animate and infinite, and that this was the true way to understand religion, but that if you want to understand religion of this true kind, you can find it present throughout history, and it goes right back to Egypt, back to Hermes Trismegistus and the other Egyptian sages of that time. So Hermes suddenly becomes important. It's not that he hadn't been there in the earlier stage, but he was just a little token, rather than the nucleus. In the second phase, Hermes takes over from the Catholic interpretation. We no longer hear so much about this is a true Catholic interpretation. It's not a attempted an Irenic interpretation. It's now we have a full-blooded version of the ancient Egyptians, pantheists. The world was animate, the universe was animate. This was the true religion, and I, Bruno, am restoring that too. In addition, as it were, to that earlier phase of her study of Bruno, which the Cambridge University Press didn't like the sound of, there is also this element of gnosis that turns up and becomes essential to her thinking about them. The idea here is that in the Pinanda, for example, but not solely in the Pinanda, you have the idea of the soul breaking out of its earthly, its material, corporeal confines, bursting through the spheres. That's actually the word that is used. I'll come back to that in a moment. Bursting through the spheres and going back to its true home, the Platonic idea of the true home of the soul, beyond and outside, and bursting into the infinite yonder. And that certainly is present in the Pimanda. It's also certainly present in Bruno as well. So, with those two ideas of gnosis coming from the Pimanda, and also this idea of the Hermetic, the ancient Egyptian religion, on those ideas she really constructed this Hermetic Bruno, who owed his thinking was essentially a recuperation of these elements. I'll just read you a couple of passages from Bruno to give you a better sense of the way he expresses his ideas. This is a famous passage quoted by Frances Yates herself in her book, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. The dispatch of the triumphant beast, dispatch of the Bestia Triumphante, 1594, 1584. And this is Hermes himself speaking, or about to speak. From this you can infer, this is one of the speakers in the dialogue, how the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians, which is now lost, worshipped not just the earth, moon, sun, and heavenly bodies, that is, everything is animate up there, but also crocodiles, lizards, snakes, and honeybees down here. I should add this very interesting passage, and the earlier one that some of you may know, has got a lot of other subtle criticism of Christian ideas about what can be killed or not, and what can be eaten, garlic, onions, snakes, and so forth, but I'll have to leave those aside, I'm afraid. Hermes Trismegistus lamented this magical and divine religion by which the divine so fittingly communicated with mankind when he spoke to Asclepius thus. Do you see, Asclepius, these animate statues? Animate statues. Everything is animate, and statues too, full of sensation and spirit that produce so great and so many effects. Do you see these statues, I say, these prognosticators of future things that induce infirmity, or cure happiness or sadness, in measure deserved by our bodily disposition? Goes on and on. Alas, the time will come when Egypt will appear in vain to have been the religious nurturer of divinity, when divinity departing to the heavens will leave Egypt deserted, only to be, of course, restored back in Roma in due course, and several thousands of years later. So there's this idea of animation and religion and the Egyptian past and Bruno's restoration of it. And here is Frances Yates in this earlier version talking about this idea of animation in the host. Bruno's insistence that the divine breath of life is really in it, that the Copernican theory is no empty formula, is a translation in philosophical terms of this highly mystical, indeed magical interpretation of the sacrament. The idea that the Copernican theory is important is because it destroys the old idea of the cosmos and allows Bruno to go on to the infinite one. And the infinite universe is the infinite expression of an infinite God. There's also some light imagery, sun imagery, and so on, but those are, in a way, secondary to that principal idea. So, now to just think about that Gnostic idea that I mentioned, you hear a couple of passages where you can see Yates thinking about how to connect Hermes and Giordano Bruno. These are passages, this is a passage from, first of all, Yates herself. Under the impression that the Copernican discovery has abolished the spheres to which the stars were formerly thought of as attached, Bruno sees this as a breaking of those envelopes in which the Hermetic Gnostic ascended and descended through the spheres as described in the Commandment. Bruno has made the Gnostic ascent, has had the Hermetic experience, and so become divine with the powers within him. Because of course the soul too is part of the universe and is divine. We're all fragments of the world soul, which is the immanent expression of God in things. Here is Bimanda, thank you, Brian, for the translation. Do you see how many bodies we must pass through, my child? How many troops of demons, cosmic connections, and stellar circuits in order to hasten towards the one and only? For the good is untraversable, infinite, and unending. It is also without beginning, but to us it seems to have a beginning, our knowledge of it. And here is Bruno saying exactly the same thing. Now here he is, more or less. Now here he is, the Nolan, that is where Bruno comes from, a small town near Naples called Nola. The Nolan has traversed the sphere of air, passed into the heavens, run through the stars, surpassed the ends of the world, dispelled the fantastic walls of the first, 8th, 9th, 10th spheres, and other spheres still, that the accounts of frivolous mathematicians and the blind vision of scholastic philosophers have seen fit to add. And so we are led to discover the infinite effect of the infinite cause, the true and living vestige of the infinite power, and recognize that we should not search for the divine outside us, but that we have it within, quite sort of powerful stuff, quite hidden in its own way. And into this scheme, we're now really in the, Yates is writing a book, in the 1950s. We're not quite sure. Her accounts of how she came to write the book tend to vary from one memorandum to the other, but she does say in 1955 that she'd begun a book on Bruno's memory, which then turns, as I'm sure you know, into a book on Bruno, which explains enough about Bruno for her to complete a chapter on Bruno in her book on the art of memory. But the idea here in the art of memory part of it, which is all part of the same Bruno, it's not kind of two separate Brunos, is that the various diagrams in Bruno's works show that her art of memory, Bruno's art of memory that is designed to be a way of drawing down the astral influences from the heavens to the practitioner of the memory tricks, so that he, or she, can also understand himself gnostically, understand how their mind is consonant with the mind that informs the universe, and also allows that mind, that soul, to operate in it. So we have Bruno the Hermeticist as a dominant thinking that leads up to the famous books of 1964 and 1966. Yates was not shy of explaining how unorthodox this interpretation was. This is just a small excerpt from the introduction to Giordano Bruno in the Hermetic tradition. The 9 chapters on Bruno presented him, 9 chapters in the book, as a variation of the Hermetic Kabbalist tradition. This is so revolutionary that I have not been able to use much of the vast literature on Bruno, it is vast, Shakespearean in proportion, in Italian, save for biographical and documentary material and some other works which are acknowledged in the notes. This is quite an extraordinary statement. I'm going to write a book about Michelangelo, but actually I found nothing very much use at all in any of the things that have been written about him before, except 1 or 2 occasional footnotey things that I can add to it. It was exactly as she said, though. It was completely revolutionary. And why? Well, Bruno, as I mentioned before, was and had been seen for centuries as a philosopher, as the forerunner of modern scientific interpretation of the cosmos, as the great martyr of philosophy in an attempt to maintain its independence from religion. This was a vein of thinking that goes more or less from the time that he was executed in 1600 until, say, the time that Yates was writing. He was identified as a Spinozist, that is, a precursor of Benedict Spinoza's theory of substance monism. All was just one thing, of which we are all the modes. There are really extraordinary similarities between the two thinkers in many ways, not to be overdone. And these similarities were noted, and when Spinoza became, having been a total atheist and somebody to be despised, became the great cream modern thinker with the German Enlightenment, Bruno went along in his coattails and became in his own right one of the great thinkers. All of the great German philosophers, Schlegel, Hegel, Goethe, you name them, they all knew their Bruno, not directly, by hearsay, and they represented for them this great modern thinker. Really, the first step that allowed people like Spinoza to move on to a modern understanding of philosophy. But that picture remains there into the 1950s. Added to that, we have an Italian interpretation. Bruno becomes the great martyr of rationalism for those who wish to see him as a standard around which you can rally your antagonisms towards the Catholic Church. He becomes a great national hero, a monument is put up to him. In all of this, everything that I've said so far, Bruno has none. The word Hermes never appears. Not once. I have not read everything, but he just simply does not appear. You can find a few exceptions in the 17th century. People who take little bits and pieces of his more zany theories, but these have got very little sidecars rather than the name Bruno that we're thinking about. And the picture remains the same. Into the 1900s, all of the great Italian intellectuals, Gentile, for example, and many others besides, the great German Italian scholars of Bruno, talk about him as this philosopher, adding in, if you want to, that he was also a martyr for science and so on. Not one time, I believe, does the name Hermes appear. And even somebody like Antonio Corsano, who wrote the first book that really took on board the magic element, not even he mentions Hermes once. It's as if he just did not exist. And here, suddenly, 1964, somebody says, I'm sorry, all of that's we put aside, we are now going to think about Hermes and Bruno, because that is the true cue for understanding. It's a very extraordinary statement. Although it was perfectly new, can I have 5 minutes?
Yeah, we're just 5, because we're getting towards 3:30.
All of this is perfectly, all of this had a little backdrop. There were many currents of thinking at the time, both in a more generic way, an appreciation of irrationalism in the 20th century, but also the revision of typical Renaissance ideas, typical interpretation of the Renaissance, this progressive movement. So you get people like Thorndike, Duhem, eroding medieval and Renaissance, Cristella amongst them too. Cristella, who then finds the new Hermetic treatise, Garin as well. So there were kind of precedents to this, but nobody had pinned Bruno down in this way. What is, just to finish off, what I think the question that I wanted to explain, or is to answer, is, well, what is wrong with Yates's interpretation? We've seen quite clearly that Hermes is there, and quite clearly that he is the kind of said to be the foundation of his own religion. This is Bruno saying this, and Yates points to it, and nobody can take that away from her. And yet, there's something wrong. And as many have done, and as actually been said in connection with the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, Yates tends to exaggerate her thesis. Not so much in Bruno books, but certainly later on. What is kind of wrong, perhaps, if I could put it in rather black and white terms, is her understanding what Hermes represents for Bruno. It's not that Bruno really thinks of Hermes in the way that he is the person who's got the truth, and I will now explain it to you. It's more, he is a way of dissolving all of the previous philosophical currents, attempts to be true, and turn them to his own purposes. That is to say, if you think of what we've got from the Hermetic corpus, it's not very much. There's so much missing that Bruno then had to fill in. He takes it from wherever he can. He takes it from Plato, from Aristotle, from Lucretius, from the Stoics, from everywhere. He pieces it together like a huge jigsaw puzzle of his own. And so what you end up with, not a syncretic Bruno, not a Bruno who is saying, I'm going to draw together all of these truths, but I'm going to put together my own picture. And Hermes is a kind of way of saying none of all of these philosophies is absolutely true. The real one is the Hermes, okay, but I don't know very much about that, so I'll use what I can from other bits and pieces, and make my own picture. And I leave you with this last thought, which I think is true, and I'm happy to be challenged on. And this made Bruno, truly, which I don't think Yates properly emphasized, Bruno becomes the first philosopher since antiquity who proposes a philosophy of his own that is not aimed at trying to explain Christianity. If you think of Ficino, his pious Platonic philosophy, you think of Aristotelian philosophers, they're remaining within their own mold of Aristotelianism. Bruno instead is proposing something completely new that is his own. And Hermes is there to help him to propose this, not as something that is true, but as a way of collecting his thoughts around something that is his own. Thank you. I'm sorry if I've taken too long.
So, welcome back. Are you ready? I hope you have enjoyed your tea. D.T. Suzuki, Japanese philosopher and scholar, said that when he was sipping tea in his tea room, he was swallowing the whole universe. So after 3 sessions of our workshop on Frances Yates' work and legacy, I hope you had a similar experience just now. For Suzuki, the very moment of lifting the bowl to his lips was eternity itself, transcending time and space. Tomorrow is the day for esotericism, but you can access the ultimate mysteries of the cosmos also through poetry, philosophy, and science, and this is what we're going to hear during this 4th section. Our first speaker of this section is Brian Copenhaver. Brian Copenhaver is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and History at the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor Copenhaver has taught and published about philosophy, religion, science in late medieval and early modern Europe. As for the next speaker, it will take a long time to account for your scholarship, your publications, your honors, your awards, but the most important thing of your career, of course, is that you studied at the Warburg. So Brian Copenhaver, all changed utterly. Renaissance philosophy and science after Frances Yates.
When you, as some of you know, but not all of you, when you get to be 76 years old, never do without mnemonic devices. Mnemonic devices, as Frances Yates knew, are very, very, very important. These are some of my mnemonic devices. So, we're on, good. I'm very, very honored to be talking here today in this place about Frances Yates, and I thank Bill Sherman very warmly for the invitation. In June of 1969, I was on my way home from France, where I had been working for a year writing a thesis about an obscure French physician named Saint-Paulin Champier. And on my way home, I stopped in London. I had done a master's thesis on newspapers, news books as they were called, in the English Civil War. So my education before I turned away from it was very, very conventional in the way of Tudor Stuart constitutional, social, political history and the way it was taught in those days in the United States. So when I stopped here on my way home from Lyon, the first place I went to was this building, which was the headquarters of the Institute for Historical Research, and probably still is, I imagine. And I went there, I looked around, I looked at the bulletin boards for the names of seminars, and found myself utterly bored. It was not me, right? It had been me a few years before that, but by that time it wasn't. And the difference, of course, was I'd been reading things by Frances Yates and Herman Walker and other things that they led me to. So with that in mind, I looked around for the Warburg. I didn't know where it was. Of course, I didn't know where anything in London was. I'd never been in London before. I looked around, I found the Warburg, and never looked back. It's never been the same for me since. For half a century now, the Warburg has been the center of my intellectual life, even when I haven't been here physically. And I've been here a great deal physically, in very, very, very formative ways. I'm not going to talk very long today. That's one thing to understand. So if I talk slowly, don't be alarmed, because I won't be talking long. And also, I'm not going to say anything especially original. And then the third thing that's very important is, pour ça que je vais dire, le bon Dieu n'est pas dans le détail, right? For what I'm going to say, the good Lord is not in the details. And of course, that's a very un-Warburgian way to look at anything, right? Very, very counter-Warburg, but it's true of what I'm going to say today. All changed utterly. All changed utterly. When William Butler Yeats wrote those words, that poem about the Easter Rising of 1916, Frances Amelia Yates had recently lost her brother in World War I, just about a year before Yeats wrote those words. All changed utterly. And in that same spring of 1916, Frances Yates began her career as a writer of magnificent English prose. Magnificent English prose. And she did it by starting a journal. This is what she wrote in that journal. She wrote, quote, "I have decided that I will never publish the journal," unquote. But eventually, she did publish quite a few other things, even though she didn't publish the journal. Not as a soldier, like her brother, or a poet, like the other Irish Yates. This very English Frances Yates stays in my memory along with that immortal line, all changed utterly. But why? What makes that connection for me? Why do I think of that when I think of Frances Yates? The connection is this. During my lifetime, she changed, and changed utterly, the field of study which has formed my life since 1964, really. 5 years before I first met her here, or down the street, rather. Like her, and not unlike the Irish poet, and certainly like Marlowe's character, during the last 55 years, 'tis magic. Magic that hath ravished me. Early on in my life as a reader and a teacher of old books, this ravishment caused me to make a mistake, to take a risk that I probably shouldn't have taken because I wasn't ready for it. In 1972, teaching as an assistant professor without tenure in a remote province of the northwestern United States, I decided to offer and to advertise a course about magic. That was my rash decision. I called the course Magic, Astrology, Witchcraft, and Demonology, the academic study of occultism. I added the word academic to the title as an apotropaic gesture, hoping that my poster for the course would be a kind of amulet. That was my hope. But my new course, naturally, this was a custom, these were the regulations, my new course had to be approved by a committee of faculty elders who were not appeased by my clever prophylaxis. No, the mighty professors were baffled. They were perplexed. Indeed, they were hostile. Because no such thing as I proposed to teach had ever been heard of in the year of our Lord, 1972, in the town of Bellingham, in the state of Washington. That was my problem. Now, seeing that I needed more potent magic, I asked the professors to look at a pile of books that I brought with me to the committee meeting. These books, I explained, had been published by distinguished university and commercial presses. So I said to the assembled professors, I said, we at Western Washington State College would be wise. This was my argument. We would be wise to follow where the University of Chicago and Routledge had gone before us. My course, thanks to the more potent magic of Frances Yates, was indeed approved, thanks to the magic of the art of memory and the Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition, and many, many other books which have been and will be discussed in these 2 days. Now, here's the thing. If I had taken the same risk 20 years earlier, if I had taken that risk, let's say in 1952, not in 1972, my course might not have been approved. Times were different then. Times were different then when, for people like me, things had not yet changed utterly, as they would soon be changed by Frances Yates. Now, there were many students of magic before Frances Yates, and we could name their names for a long time. Berthelot, Bidet, Beau, Boucher de Clare, Coulon, Dietrich, Gundel, Homyard, Hoffner, Knock, Preissendance, Greer, Wilska, Thorndike, and many, many others. There were lots and lots of people who had spoken learnedly and richly and with effect about magic during the 19th and 20th centuries. There's no question about that. But none of those people spoke with a voice, as far as I can tell, which was both learned and demonic. And that's what Frances did. She spoke with a voice which was both learned and demonic. And that, I think, has made a great deal of difference. To illustrate the situation that I'm talking about, as it was, let's say, in 1952, I'll repeat a well-known story, but I'm sure this story is known to many of you in the audience, Walter and Stephen and others, especially Yuri. It's a story about George Sarton and Otto Neugebauer and some wretched books, as they were called, wretched books about magical subjects. So the picture you're seeing is a picture of the journal about the history of science, the premier journal of the history of science as it's been ever since, founded by George Sarton in 1913. And then, much later, in 1950, Sarton did basically all of the reviewing for ISIS that he couldn't convince anybody else to do. And this included little scrappy reviews of no more than 2 or 3 sentences for books that weren't going to get much notice. And Sarton was reviewing one of these books. It happened to be about ancient astrology, ancient Mandean astrology, for those of you who are interested in Mandean astrology. And Sarton infamously dismissed the topic as miscellaneous nonsense and superstitious flotsam. That was in 1950. 1 year later, in Sarton's own journal, in ISIS, and of course this speaks well of Sarton because he published it, he was the editor, Otto Neugebauer, a very famous scholar, an expert on ancient astronomy, among other things, and mathematics, Otto Neugebauer responded to Sarton in ISIS, and he wrote, quote, "When the recognized dean of the history of science disposes of a whole field as superstitious flotsam, the result is the destruction of the very foundation of our studies." Now, what was going on? What was going on was that Neugebauer felt obliged to answer Sarton because in those days, most readers in the United States of a journal like ISIS would have agreed with Sarton, just spontaneously, instinctively, by nature. They would have agreed that magic and astrology were wretched subjects that simply had no place in an academic journal. That's the way the world was in 1952. Frances Yates changed all that, changed it utterly, by writing about magic and I'm using the word magic here in a very loose way. It stands for a lot of things: magic, astrology, witchcraft, demonology, Kabbalah, etc., 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 right? She changed all that by writing about magic in powerful prose. Powerful prose. That was both demonic and learned. Her book on John Florio, it's been talked about before. It's an example of one of the books, many books and articles, which she wrote as she was learning the craft of writing, before she got to the stage of her career that Elizabeth was talking about this morning. It's how she learned to write. Frances, I think, was a born writer, and you can tell that by looking at her journal, when she had hardly had any practice at all. She was a born writer. But she learned to write even more effectively as an expert reader of Shakespeare and other English poets and French poets, and a lot of literature, a lot of well-written literature in those languages and in Latin as well. She learned to write so effectively by the reading she was doing early in her career. And then later, Later, she displayed that talent to the world. In the early days, these were crucial early days of the New York Review of Books. I think many of you know that the New York Review of Books started in 1963 when there was a newspaper strike in New York. And because there was a newspaper strike, the New York Times couldn't publish the New York Times Book Review. So there weren't any book reviews, and that was unthinkable in those days. So Bob Silvers and some other people decided to put something out, and what they put out turned into the New York Review of Books, beginning in 1963. Then, Frances Yates began to write for the New York Review of Books in the next year, in 1964. This is the first issue of the New York Review from 1964 in which Frances published a review. She kept on reviewing after that, year after year after year. She published reviews about very, very eminent thinkers. Many of them, most of them, having something to do with Renaissance studies, naturally, because that was her expertise. In 1964, when she wrote her first review, the book she had been assigned happened to be Paul Christeller's famous 8 Philosophers of the Italian Renaissance. And she began by observing, first sentence of the review, quote, "Renaissance philosophy is something of a no man's land in the history of thought," unquote. And that was a view, by the way, that Christeller shared. He thought of Renaissance philosophy as sort of second rate, not really up to snuff if the comparison point was Kant. Thanks to Yates's discussions of books by Mikhail Bakhtin, Robert Klein, Giuseppe Brezzolini, Paolo Rossi, Brian Vickers, Perkin Walker, Charles Webster, and dimmer lights like Brian Copenhaver, this no man's land became a boulevard during the next 20 years, while Frances was writing things for the New York Review of Books, and so was Perkin. He was writing reviews also in that period. And that had a big effect on culture in the United States. Great learning, brave imagination, rhapsodic prose, and seductive storytelling made Yates a culture hero by the late 60s. After her long career of inconspicuous scholarship finally beat the long odds in British or any other academia against a woman with no higher degree. What she accomplished was extraordinary. Giordano Bruno, the Hermetic tradition, the art of memory, the occult philosophy in the Elizabethan age, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, the French academies of the 16th century, the theater of the world, the study of Love's Labour's Lost, the Valois tapestries, Majesty and Magic in Shakespeare's last plays, Australia, the imperial theme in the 16th century. There are more books that she wrote, so why am I listing those? Well, it so happens if you Google Amazon.com and you plug Frances Yates into the author bracket, that's what you get. All those books are now easily purchasable, right? And this is by a scholar who was born in 1899 and who died, what, 1981, isn't that right? 1981? That's remarkable. That's incredible, as a matter of fact. The reach that she achieved with her books is absolutely astonishing. You know, you go on with this. Today, the average academic book has a press run of 500 copies. A really sort of robust academic book that the publisher has some hopes for has a press run of 1,500 copies. God only knows how many copies of those books have been sold, but I can tell you it's more than 15,000. It's probably more than 150,000. It's extraordinary. More than anyone else, she convinced the Anglo-American world of learning that magic and the Hermetica were issues of great moment. That's what she accomplished. No small feat. Almost 20 years after she died, the Cambridge History of Philosophy published a chapter on, quote, the occultist tradition and its critics, unquote. And this chapter stands in that volume alongside accounts of Descartes and Galileo and Leibniz and Newton. A little later, a similar chapter in the Cambridge History of Science also made magic part of the story of post-medieval science. I can tell you for sure that those magi would never have made that journey into those precincts of the academy without a roadmap from Frances Yates. That's for certain sure. Not everyone applauded, as we all know. Not everyone applauded. Least of all, historians of science who put the Yates thesis, as it's still called, on Hermetic science into the headlines of learned controversy. The controversy goes on. It's never stopped since it started in the 60s and 70s. This is a recent article in the Journal of Mormon History, volume 41, and as you can see from the title, it's about refiner's fire and the Yates thesis, which people are still talking about. And as you can see, they're talking about it very recently. This is 2015. And what they have to say is that they're building on Frances Yates's highly influential Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. So, to say it in an even more demonic way than Frances would say it, the beat goes on. No doubt about it. Magic, because of Frances, was wretched no longer. People kept talking about it, talking about it, and talking about it. And she was certainly right to take magic seriously. She was also right to say that magic resembles science. That was a very controversial thing to say when she said it. Why? Well, because both science and magic theorize about nature, and both, in the long run, aim to change nature. That's why it makes sense to study them as items that have some similarities. However, where to take those similarities, where to take those resemblances, when they're resemblances of that magnitude, that's a different matter. That's a different question. So, thinking of my own work on magic, my main response to Frances Yates' work is enormous gratitude for inspiration. That's my main response. Differences of opinion are less meaningful to me, and yet the differences are important. From my perspective, and for purposes of our talk here, I can highlight 6 disagreements that stand out in my mind when I think of her work. And I'll begin, of course, with Hermes Trismegistus. In my view, the Greek Hermetica, translated by Marsilio Ficino in the Quattrocento, are about devotional theology and religion. The texts themselves, the Greek texts that Ficino put into Latin, they're simply not about magic. Now, if you take any ancient text of that period, whether it's a philosophical text or a medical text or a poetic text, or it doesn't matter much. And when it comes to the point where issues, let's say, of cosmology are going to come up, then what you're going to get is the standard post-Aristotelian, Ptolemaic, concentric universe of spheres. And people would say, well, that's magic. Well, if that's magic, everything is magic. And it doesn't make sense to offer a distinction between when we're talking about magic, when we're talking about medicine, when we're talking about pharmacy, when we're talking about anything, right? If things of that magnitude are magical. If not, if magic is something more specific, then you can look long and hard for it in the Hermetica that Ficino translated when he did his epical work in the early 1460s. Those Hermetica that Ficino translated, and this is my second point of disagreement, those Greek Hermetica that he translated were seen by him, by Ficino himself, as theological, not as about magic. And the reason we can tell this is we can read the introduction that he wrote for his translation and various letters that he wrote about it. He didn't see this material as magical. He saw it as theological, which is what it was. It's popular devotional theology. So that's my second point of disagreement. And that's a disagreement where the central item of contention is these Greek texts, which were translated by Ficino in the late Quattrocento, right? So I'm not talking about Bruno. I'm not talking about whatever the word Hermetic might or might not mean for Bruno. I'm talking about Ficino in the late 15th century. The reason that's so important is because in the first half of the Bruno book, not the second half, which is about Bruno, the first half really is about Ficino and Pico, where Frances made the points that she made. So that's why I'm stressing that. So that's the Greek Hermetic, right? Well, we can turn the page and we can ask the same kind of question, not about the Greek Hermetica, but about the Latin Asclepius. And if we look at the Latin Asclepius, you'll find two passages. In fact, Dylan showed us one this morning. The passage from where Bruno was writing about the Asclepius is actually a fairly close paraphrase of one of the two passages from the Asclepius that Frances focused on. The two passages about Egyptian god-making in the Latin Asclepius, which Ficino did not need to translate, of course, because they had translated a long time ago. Those two passages are about demonolatry. That's what they're about. And that, like all faithful Christians, Ficino had to denounce. And he did denounce it in chapter 26 of the last of his 3 books on life. And then there's Giovanni Pico da Mirandola. The magic promoted by Pico in his famous oration, I won't call it the oration on the dignity of man, because Pico never wrote an oration on the dignity of man. He wrote an oration, but never gave it that title, and it's not about the dignity of man, it's about other things. The magic promoted by Pico in that oration was in no way Hermetic. I throw that a challenge. That's a challenge. My challenge is to anybody who can show me that there's Hermetic magic, or indeed Hermetic much of anything in Pico's oration. Pico writes at some length. I mean, the oration is a short text, right? It's only 7,000 words. And the words devoted to magic are about 700 or 800. And if you read those 700 or 800 words, what you'll find is Pico does 2 things. First, he very briefly gives you his theory of magic, essentially kind of natural magic. And the second thing he does is to give you a little history of magic. And that history, as you would expect, given Pico's framework and his relationship with Ficino, that history is embedded in the context that's come to be known because of Perkin Walker's scholarship as the ancient theology. When I say ancient theology, everybody in this room knows what I'm talking about. Well, when Pico laid out the ancient theology as the matrix of magic, he never mentioned Hermes. He mentioned Zoroaster, but not Hermes, because he didn't think of magic as hermetic. In the 900 conclusions, there are 119 conclusions about Kabbalah. There are 56 conclusions about Thomas Aquinas. There are 55 about Proclus. There are 43, I think, about Averroes. There are 10 about Hermes Trismegistus. 10. And none of them is about magic. It's about metaphysical psychology or psychological metaphysics. That's a picture you've seen before. One of Bruno's memory wheels, the most famous one. And this is a picture that some of you have seen before. That's a picture of Yates's picture of Bruno's memory system. According to me, in my view, the analysis of Bruno's memory images by Rita Stolese and others, Torchiano, have done similar things after her. That analysis of Bruno's memory images as devices to enhance memory, not to transmit astral forces. That analysis makes better sense of the evidence. The evidence is challenging, no doubt about that, but makes better sense of the evidence than the account given by Yates. And then finally, we come to the Rosicrucians. What you're looking at is Gabriel's Naudet, his pamphlet called The Instruction to France on the Truth, the Story of the Rosicrucian Brothers, which was published in Paris in 1623. So there, again, according to me, the story told by Didier Kahn that the Rosicrucian frenzy was a lightweight hoax. The part of the Rosicrucian frenzy that happened in Paris, right, was a lightweight hoax. That's more plausible. It holds together better than the story told by Yates. Still, it goes without saying that neither Stolese, nor Kahn, nor I, nor any of Yates's critics would ever have questioned her findings had she not made her views so prominent and so compelling to so many others. Much more important, without her brave pioneering of those wretched subjects, I and others would never have had a chance to ask such questions at all. Had she not done what she did, had she not rescued this wretched subject, the course that I proposed in 1972 at Western Washington State University would probably never have been allowed in a classroom. And I don't know what I'd be doing today, but I wouldn't be doing this, right? If that happened, maybe I would have run for office. I don't know. That poster never would have gone up and never would have brought me the considerable dose of grief, but also happiness that it brought me. Now, to summarize, when the Irish Yates died in 1939, a great English poet made Yates's immortality a little bit more immortal, with an elegy that begins with these lines that you all know very well. Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yates is laid to rest. They're very beautiful lines, so I'll say it again. Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yates is laid to rest. Because part of our work during these 2 days is to honor an English Yates who is no longer with us in the body. Such thoughts as Auden's are in order. And here's a version of those thoughts by a lesser poet. The house of Warburg still is blessed by Frances Yates, long gone to rest. The house of Warburg still is blessed by Frances Yates, long gone to rest. Now, that's the portal. That's the gateway to Abi Warburg's temple of memory, as it was in Hamburg. And I doubt any of us in this room have ever walked through that portal physically. Have you? Anybody ever been there when it was like that? Have you? Okay. I envy you. I envy you. But many of us, maybe all of us, have been there spiritually. And we've obviously been through a portal, which is very much like that. And like you, when I've walked through that portal, I've always felt the company of others who have entered that temple before me. Others like Frances Yates. And so, very much, I think, in the Warburg tradition. My final word today is that word, Hermeticism, which always lives. Memory always lives. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Now, our second speaker, it's a top-hosting chairmanship to say needs no introduction. But as many commonplaces, there is a grain of truth. Really, Peter does not need any introduction. Let me just say that he's Emeritus Professor of Cultural History and Fellow of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. That his several books on the early modern era have become classics, and that we all know his amazing contribution to scholarship. Peter.
Okay, so thank you, Alessandro, for the generous introduction, and it's a difficult act to follow that of Brian Copenhagen, but it inspires me to think about a 20th century quotation from a poem which will actually sum up the paper you're about to hear. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. Because I want to go back to the questions raised by Elizabeth at the very beginning of today's conference. And she presents Frances as a Warburgian, and I want to do something that's complementary to that, which is to talk about how somebody who was trained in a very different tradition from the Warburgian tradition becomes, what's the right word, Warburgized, Warburgified, or whatever. Because one way of commemorating somebody who made an important contribution to intellectual history is to attempt to reconstruct her own intellectual history. So I'm concentrating now on the development of Frances Yates in the first half of her long life. Because although Frances owed a great deal to the Institute and was very happy to acknowledge the inspiration it gave her, a number of her interests, not to mention her way of doing history, had crystallized before this Warburgization. Of course, she wasn't a normal, specialized academic. She worked in her own way, happily regardless of the frontiers between departments and disciplines. In that sense, maybe others, she was undisciplined. She saw her life as an intellectual adventure in which one thing simply led to another. Noting in her second book that Florio, I quote, led us to Eliot, who led us to Harvey, who led us to Chapman, and so to the School of Night, and so on, led on to Bruno and beyond Bruno and so on. her interests kept expanding, but old enthusiasms were not abandoned. I like to view Frances as a kind of detective, let's say the Miss Marple of the scholarly world. She loved to ask very precise questions. Was Florio a model for Holofernes? Did Chapman know Dürer's engraving of the Melancholia? And then to answer such questions, she would follow clues, and she'd reconstruct situations in her vivid imagination. As you've already heard today, Frances began her academic career as an external student of French at University College London. But acting and going to the theatre were extremely important activities in her family. So it's no surprise to find she went on to do an MA, wrote a thesis on the French theatre of the Renaissance. Then her first article, 1925, was about English actors in Paris in Shakespeare's time. And the second article, published 1927, was the one discussing topical allusions in a French play about Mary, Queen of Scots. It was at this point that she turned to the study of John Florio. Maybe a natural choice, because this Elizabethan Italian stood at the crossroads of French literature on one side, since he translated Montaigne, and Shakespeare studies on the other side, since he may be satirized or parodied by Shakespeare in Love's Labour's Lost. So the book on Florio, which took a lot of time because it involved a lot of research, some of it in the Public Record Office, it was finally published 1934. Looking back at it from the end of her life, the author described it rather cruelly as representing, I quote, the English scholarship of an age when literary history was often not much interested in the history of ideas. Basically, in that book, she was reconstructing Florio's biography. But looking back at this book now, from a very different perspective, I think the presence of two features which would recur in her later work become immediately obvious. The first is the propensity to fill in the considerable gaps in Florio's life with speculation, with possibly, with may have, and even with what if. The second recurrent feature is the interest she shows in reconstructing an intellectual circle. She speaks of Florio's, I quote, vast circle of acquaintances, linking him to Giordano Bruno, to Samuel Daniel, to Richard Hakluyt, or should I say Hacklewit, and finally to William Shakespeare. And then in the second book, the study of Love's Labour's Lost, which she wrote more quickly, published 2 years after the first, Frances Yates refers more than once to what she calls the Southampton Circle, including, of course, Shakespeare. So at this point, it might be illuminating to try to reconstruct her own intellectual circle in the 1930s, or scholars now say, I think, more usefully, her network. Problem with circles is we imagine them as closed. You're either inside or outside. The beauty of a network is that you can be simply closer to the center or further from the center, and that everybody has their own network with themselves at the center. That, I think, makes this concept more useful in writing history. Anyway, her intellectual network at this time, I think, was dominated by specialists in literature, especially 16th century literature. The Florio book acknowledges the help of the Professor of English at UCL, C.J. Sisson. And in her biography of Frances, Marjorie Jones, who had access to the personal journals, notes how often C.J. Sisson's name appears in the journals at this particular time. But I think still more important were two other literary dons, G.B. Harrison, F.S. Boas. In that age, as you remember, so many male scholars preferred to be known by initials rather than by their first names. Harrison, reader in English in King's College London, was interested in placing Shakespeare's work in social context, and in particular in the context of what he called the things most talked about in late Elizabethan London. And in the 1930s and 40s, Frances reminisced later, I quote, "I belonged to a little literary society called the Elizabethan Literary Society, run by Professor F.S. Boas, who was very kind to me in my early days." Boas, a retired inspector of schools and a former professor of both history and English at Queen's College, Belfast, was the author of a book on Marlowe, a book that discussed the so-called School of Night a few years before Frances did it in Love's Labour's Lost. Now I want to suggest that her apprenticeship as a Shakespeare scholar helped to shape the way in which Frances thought and worked in later years. She shared the Harrison-Boas combination of a close attention to texts and a concern with contexts. Even the idea of an intellectual circle can be found in this circle, as the title of Boas's book on Marlowe reveals it. Marlowe and His Circle, 1929. A title that may have been inspired, my turn to speculate, by the Vienna Circle and the Prague Circle, both of which were flourishing at exactly this time. But Frances Yates was not just a Shakespearean. She was developing in other directions at this time, moving from history of literature towards history of ideas. As we've heard already, she discussed Giordano Bruno for the first time in the 1920s, and again right up to that book of 1964. In other words, the ideas put forward in Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition were the fruit of more than 30 years study, familiarity with Bruno's work. But once again, one thing led to another. As everyone knows, the study of Bruno led Frances to another intellectual circle centered this time on the Warburg Institute. The year 1936, she said, much later, was a turning point in my life. The year that Dorothea Singer introduced her to Edgar Wendt, Fritz Saxel, Gertrude Bing, and what Frances described as an inspiring library that had recently arrived from Germany. Saxel and Wendt had both read John Florio. They must have been impressed, or in need of more English contacts, or both, because they were very quick to incorporate Frances into their network. The first volume of the Journal of the Warburg Institute already carried an article by her. She published in the second volume, the third volume as well. So it remains to consider what exactly was the inspiration given by this institute in the early years of her association with it. First as a visitor, reader in the library, and then a fellow. To answer this question, let's at least begin with her retrospective view of the matter, though memory plays tricks on us, and one can't take a retrospective view, however sincerely put forward, as gospel. But she wrote rather nicely of being initiated into the method of the Institute, into what she called the Warburgian technique of using visual evidence as historical evidence. The importance of the 28 illustrations in French academies and the 48 illustrations in the Valois tapestry supports this view, as well as reminding us that the use of images as evidence by historians of ideas or historians of politics was still unusual in the 1940s and 50s, if not downright eccentric. What she learned at this time is also clarified by the remark that the Warburg Library was, I quote again, designed to present the history of culture as a whole. And again, quoting, to use art, music, philosophy, religion for the elucidation of one phenomenon. We could say interdisciplinary. My guess is she would have disliked the word, but approved of the project. And this style of history, cultural history, included the concern with occult philosophy. Frances had already made a brief reference to Hermes in a study of Love's Labours Lost. But of course, at that point, she still saw Giordano Bruno as a modern scientist. As she wrote later, displaying her remarkable capacity for self-criticism, and even, I think, exaggerating her earlier limitations, I quote, "The author, myself in those days, has little knowledge of what Giordano Bruno is talking about, and seems never to have heard of Hermes Trismegistus." So the later interest in magic, Kabbalah, Neoplatonism effectively developed after her encounter with Birkenwalker, even before he went to the Warburg, and then to the other Warburgians, or some of them. So as I say, one has to take very seriously what somebody thinks about their own early life. But I think that the story about conversion, now I know she didn't use that word, but the story about a conversion to a new kind of history after being initiated at the Institute, we shouldn't accept this without a few qualifications. In the first place, there was always an affinity between those undisciplined or interdisciplinary studies and those of R.B. Warburg himself. And the other point, as is so often the case with conversions, the result of her encounter with the Institute was to encourage her to continue with more confidence in the direction in which she had already begun to move. And another recurrent phenomenon in the history of conversion, the original concerns of the convert survived alongside the new ideas. Frances never lost her interest in literature, never lost her interest in Shakespeare, indeed in writing about Shakespeare, because one of her late books is a study of Shakespeare's late plays. The famous study of the French academies, delivered as lectures in the Warburg Institute in 1940, I quote, "to an audience of half a dozen who had survived the intense cold and the breakdown of electricity and transport. That study has its roots in a passage in Love's Labours Lost. Our court shall be a little academe." And Frances also continued to be interested in intellectual circles. Her earlier concern with the School of Night was, can I say, replicated in her later work on the circle of Jean-Antoine de Baïf in the French academies. And again in the circle of Ortelius, Emmanuel van Meteren, Hufnagel, and others of the Antwerp geographical group, all discussed in the Valois tapestries. And then again in the group circle network of John Dee, Oswald Kroll, Christian of Anhalt, etc., in the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. Now, reconstructing circles or networks is an exciting method, and it sometimes reveals unexpected connections or similarities between people, places, and ideas. But it needs to be used with caution, by which I mean without assuming, as I think Frances may sometimes have done, that people who knew one another well and liked to converse with one another were necessarily of the same opinions. And so, to sum up, the itinerary that took Frances from Mallet Street via Millbank to Woburn Square was more significant for the geography of the mind than it appears on the map. Working at the Institute widened Frances's horizons. It helped her to turn from a literary historian into an intellectual and then a cultural historian. Curiously enough, in another generation and on another continent, a similar trajectory would be followed by new historicists such as Stephen Greenblatt, another Shakespearean, though one whose interests in what Frances liked to call ologies, that is, anthropology, sociology, psychology, she briskly rejected. Despite what she continued to learn in her 40s and 50s, and of course it's always remarkable to find an intellectual who's prepared to learn radically new things in their 40s and 50s, despite that, her original training in what she later called orthodox literary research, including close reading of texts, remained important. She sometimes later had harsh words, harsh for her anyway, about what she dismissed as Ing-lit. But I don't think she rejected the older tradition of literary history associated with G.B. Harrison and F.S. Boas. She simply incorporated it into a wider enterprise. Of course, this extremely fruitful encounter between a sturdy British empiricist and yet with an urge to speculate on one side, and the Central European tradition of Kulturwissenschaft on the other, was not unique to Frances Yates. It should be located within what we might call the Central European moment in English cultural history. After all, the 30s was a time when German, Austrian, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, and Polish scholars were all taking refuge in Britain. The consequences of this encounter between two styles of scholarship, or as one of the refugees, Karl Mannheim, would say, two styles of thought. The fruitful consequences of the encounter are, I believe, illustrated perhaps even more vividly than anywhere else by the intellectual development of Frances Yates. Thank you.